He will be treated like any other defendant, photographed, fingerprinted, and weighed. This comes after Trump's private plane took off from Newark Airport just a few hours ago. While outside that jail in Atlanta, security is tight tonight. On his Truth social media platform, Trump wrote he will proudly be arrested, though just before he left, he called it yet another sad day in America. Earlier today, his former chief of staff and co-defendant Mark Meadows went through the same process. The sheriff released his booking photo. There it is. So what comes next for Trump and all the other defendants? Our team is standing by tonight to break it all down for us. And we begin with ABC's senior investigative correspondent, Aaron Katersky.
Tonight, Donald Trump aboard his private jet heading to Atlanta to surrender at the Fulton County Jail. On social media, the former president calling it yet another sad day in America. Trump has already been booked in 3 other criminal cases, but this time will be different. Tonight, he will be photographed, weighed, and fingerprinted, and this time he will be released on bond, $200,000, and a pledge he won't threaten any potential witnesses, including on social media. Trump is charged with being the ringleader of a criminal enterprise attempting to overturn the 2020 election, and with heading up a pressure campaign against local Republican officials, including that phone call with Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
Also on that call, Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows.
So, Mr. President, everybody is on the line, and just so this is Mark Meadows, the chief of staff.
Meadows has been charged too and surrendered earlier today. His mugshot right here. Meadows is trying to get his case transferred to federal court. So when will these trials begin? The district attorney, Fani Willis, wants to try Trump and his 18 co-defendants together, but tonight that's in doubt. One defendant, lawyer Kenneth Chesbrough, asked for a speedy trial, and the judge agreed, setting a date of October 23rd, less than 2 months from now. Trump's lawyers quickly weighing in, saying that's way too early to put the former president on trial.
And Aaron Katersky joins us now from Atlanta. Aaron, what is the scene like outside the jail right now?
Well, the street is now shut down here in front of the jail, Stephanie, and there are a ton of police officers. Law enforcement of all stripes have been coming and going in and out of this jail all day. And the sheriff has said that he wants to treat Trump like any ordinary criminal defendant who would come to be booked here. But for many, that process can take hours. When Trump arrives here, he's only expected to be inside mere minutes, enough time to have his height and weight recorded, be fingerprinted, and perhaps even take his first mugshot. And we've learned, Stephanie, tonight that the former president is working with a local bonding company to cover the portion of his $200,000 bond that he's going to have to post in order to be released. Just stunning to think a former president of the United States is being asked to make bail.
Absolutely. It's historic. Aaron Katersky for us in Atlanta. Thank you so much. Let's bring in our John Santucci. And John, this is the 4th indictment after a 2.5-year probe. We're going to check in with John here in just a second. You can see the former president's plane landing there right now in Atlanta. This comes after, as I just mentioned, a 2.5-year probe. The former president and 18 others indicted on charges related to efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election right there in Georgia. We want to bring in John Santucci. We're going to try this one more time. John, 4th indictment, 2.5 years. What a process. Can you tell us a little bit of what your sources may be sharing with you right now about how the former president is feeling tonight?
You know, honestly, rinse and repeat, Stephanie, is what I'm hearing from my sources, that Donald Trump has now gone through this, as you noted, 3 times before, and he's ready for a 4th time. The difference, of course, is that when we've seen this former president head on his plane and head down for something related, let's just use those broad terms, to one of the investigations, it's been to a courthouse. The difference this time is to see Donald Trump walk into a jail, which we've been noting here on ABC, is under federal investigation for the way they are treating inmates, for several people that have died while they have been in the custody of that jail. A jail that, as many contributors for our network have been sharing, that they've been in, and they know the jail is of horrible terrible conditions. Now, Donald Trump's obviously not going to be exposed to much of that. He'll be in there for just a couple of seconds, hopefully, for him, because that is something that weighs on Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a germaphobe. He doesn't want to be around anything like that. So I know from my sources that's something they've prepared him for. The mugshot is something that we're still waiting to see. Every indication is that he will get one tonight. And Donald Trump, as I've seen in real time many, many times, Stephanie, Donald Trump is a guy that we know is vain. He's a guy that, always wants to tweak the lighting, like the way he looks. So to think Donald Trump is just going to have a quick photo taken, there's no approval, no weighing in, no nothing, I think that's going to really hurt Donald Trump's ego tonight, among other things.
And John, we're watching his private plane land right now in Atlanta. We should be seeing him in just a few moments. But as Aaron touched on just a few moments ago, this is historic. Prior to Trump, no former or current president had ever been indicted. Have you heard from those in his orbit? What are they saying tonight about all of this?
Well, again, I mean, I think it's very much that they've all gotten used to this. As somebody said to me, here we go again. And then they weren't even being funny about it. I think there's it's becoming rather routine for Donald Trump and his aides. And I do think a part of that is that obviously right now they are trying to deal with two calendars that are colliding in real time. They are dealing with the political calendar because Donald Trump is indeed running for president for a third time, and they are dealing with this growing, expanding court calendar. The big question right now is, where does this go? We know, based on information that came down today, because another defendant in the case is trying to push for a speedy trial, that as the moment, we could see a trial in October. Now, Donald Trump's team, Stephanie, has already responded saying, whoa, back up. That's too soon for us. And obviously, they changed lawyers today. So they have a lot of things to figure out right now as they move forward, because obviously, this is just August. We have a year and a half, a little less than that now, to go until the presidential election. But to think that it's this case and 3 others, and of course some other cases that he's dealing with here in New York, he's got a lot to figure out right now as this all moves forward.
And you mentioned the change in lawyers.
Yeah.
Do you have any more insight as to why that last-minute legal shakeup?
Drew Feinling, who was the lawyer that was terminated by Donald Trump earlier today, had actually been one of the longest lawyers as of late working for the former president, because as you noted here at the top, this has been a probe that the DA in Fulton County has been going on for over 2.5 years. I'm told that, there was a little disagreement, if you will, in the last couple of days. Donald Trump had brought Drew Feinling and Jennifer Little up to Bedminster, that's the other lawyer on the case, in the last few weeks for a briefing, trying to understand what was coming for him. And it seems as though there was not a great gelling between the two. Now, this new lawyer that comes in, Steve Sadow, comes highly recommended from other people that have been around the former president for some time. He's a guy that has dealt with RICO, dealt with tough cases, and is someone right now that Donald Trump is going to need, because, as we've been talking about here for a while, these are 19 defendants as of right now. The goal for the DA is to take that 19, get some of them to flip, and that is something that Donald Trump and his aides are really paying attention to, because if any of those individuals flips, goes against Donald Trump, it only strengthens the case against him, Stephanie.
Absolutely, John. And right now we are waiting to see the former president deplane from his private aircraft. Should take just a few minutes to get to the Fulton County Jail, but historic indeed. While we wait on the former president to deplane, let's bring in ABC News legal contributor Kim Whaley. Kim, the judge has granted a request by one of the co-defendants, Kenneth Chesebro, for a speedy trial that begins no later than October 23rd. John was just talking about that. Can you just define for us what a quote-unquote speedy trial is and what it means for these defendants, including the former president?
Essentially, it's really grounded in the Constitution. The idea is that the government can't charge you with a crime and then just sit on it and leave you in jail indefinitely. So the defendant has a right, and it's defined under a statute, the specifics of it, to say, you know what, I want you to come forward, government, with your evidence quickly so that I can move on. Most of the time, or oftentimes, that the defense will decide it's better to spend more time building the case and building the defense, but that's up to the defendant, not up to the government. So I think that this might be putting pressure on Fani Willis to maybe not have all the ducks in a row with respect to this particular defendant, and then break up the other defendants and the trial. It's kind of a strategic maneuver that's quite interesting.
Do you think that the former president would be treated any differently because of these special circumstances?
With respect to the booking today, or the case in general?
The case in general, just moving forward, especially as he plans to run for president again.
You know, I think we've already seen it, right? We've seen it in the first three arraignments, and federal cases tend to be a little nicer and a little more comfortable for defendants than these kind of state law quick cases. And going forward, my expectation is there will continue to be kid gloves, but it does look like, as John indicated, Fani Willis, and, you know, she's just going along as if it's an everyday defendant, and it really isn't. I think for the American people, for sort of the history of the presidency and all of that, it is very important that he get extra process. And we all are entitled to due process under the Constitution when the government comes and brings these kind of charges. But the stakes for democracy, for the election, all those things, I think all the judges and the lawyers involved should be taking this with as much extreme care as possible.
Mm-hmm. And we saw from the former president how he was hyping up this surrender as well. You don't typically see that with other defendants. Right now, you're looking at live images of the former president's private plane there. You can see folks from his team deplaning. We should see the former president here shortly. But Kim, what we're witnessing here tonight, this is essentially the beginning. What other steps will we see in this process? How long do you think this entire process will take? Not just what we'll see tonight in the booking, but the entire process as a whole.
So the process, the next step in all of these cases is what is called discovery, and that just means the exchange of the facts, the exchange of the evidence, the witness testimony, the documents, any texts or other kinds of electronic communications. The government has to turn some of it over under the Constitution, anything that would go towards his defense in a way undermining the government's case. If they have anything that's bad for the government, they have to turn it over. And there's also an obligation for the defendants to turn that stuff over. So there'll be that process that can take some time. Then my guess is Donald Trump's going to file motions, and the other defendants trying to throw out the case, throw out particular counts, throw out particular evidence. Now, with respect to this Georgia investigation, his former lawyers filed a mega motion. It was 400+ pages trying to get Fani Willis off the case and also trying to get some of the evidence out. And my guess is maybe part of why he's switching lawyers is because Donald Trump doesn't like to lose, and those lawyers weren't successful. It wasn't their fault, probably. These are hard motions to win. There'll be that motions process. Then we'll have to pick a jury, which is going to be difficult. And then, of course, it'd be the trial.
A lengthy process, indeed. Let's bring in John Santucci again. And John, we saw some folks there exiting the plane. Did you recognize any of them?
Is seeing Susie Wiles. So that was the woman, if we're going to wind the videotape back for our control room. She came out of the aircraft with the white hair. That is the person right now running Donald Trump's campaign. We saw a man walk up the staircase to greet her. That appears to me to look like Steve Sadow, the new lead lawyer for Trump on the Georgia case. Obviously, you would think, since they haven't had a chance to meet in person, is my understanding, this is the first time Donald Trump and his new lawyer are going to meet. And it's my understanding, Stephanie, per sources, that Sadow will be the only one to go with Trump into the jail. He's not going to be able to stay with him the entire time because of processing. But, you know, Donald Trump, who is, for lack of a better word, frankly, you know, careful about the team that surrounds him. You know, it's a close-knit circle of aides that have been with Donald Trump throughout this insanely busy summer over in Bedminster, New Jersey. Many of those folks are going to hang back. They're not going to be a part of a big motorcade like we've seen every other time Donald Trump has headed off for one of these proceedings. Sadow will be with him. Sadow will be his guide as Donald Trump, for the very first time, and I do think that's important, enters a jail.
And John, just one quick question. What do you make of the timing of all of this? Because he did have until tomorrow to turn himself in. Do you think there's something behind the timing, it being 7 o'clock Eastern time the day before, and there we could see the former president exiting the plane. But what do you think, John?
You know, I think, listen, there's a lot of ways that we could predict. You know, Donald Trump will never miss a made-for-TV moment. Donald Trump, when he was president, obviously always tried to time things for prime time, never wanted it to be, as he would refer to it, as Death Valley TV. So I think there's certainly a lexicon to that. We also know, Stephanie, that the sheriff and others communicated to lawyers for all 19 defendants in this case that later in the day, it's a little quieter at the jail. They recommended not coming first thing in the morning, and we've seen many people come in the afternoon. In one case, a few people came overnight around 3 o'clock in the morning. Donald Trump was definitely not going to do that. But I think it's a mix of everything here that's gotten us to this moment. And, you know, one thing I have heard from Team Trump, let's just get this over with already. Let's just go and let's get it done with.
And we saw the former president there exiting, waved a bit, gave his standard thumbs up, mouthed something. It's unclear what exactly he said. He is in the car now. That motorcade is expected to head to the Fulton County Jail. And we're looking at live pictures right now. We'll check in with Aaron Katursky now, who is in Atlanta. And Aaron, Trump is now in Atlanta. What is next?
He's headed this way to where I am right now, the Fulton County Jail, where he's going to be booked on the 13 criminal counts that he faces, including racketeering and other crimes that have been alleged by Fulton County District Attorney Fonnie Willis for orchestrating this criminal enterprise, as the indictment calls it, to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election here in Georgia. As the former president gets ready to head this way, 15-20-minute drive from the airport, he is going to be encountering perhaps a number of supporters. Not very many, but there are some waiting at a different entrance of the jail. It's not clear whether the former president will actually lay eyes on them as he makes his way here, but they've been waiting here all day in anticipation. A call went out from some of his supporters to rally, but none of these appearances in court, now here at the jail, have really drawn very many. But the former president has said he has been cheered by his poll numbers because this indictment, he says, it doesn't seem to be having an effect on him politically as he maintains a wide lead against his rivals for the Republican nomination. When he gets here, he is just going to see an awful lot of police officers who have taken up positions around the jail and nearby streets. When he goes in, the Secret Service will be with him, but he is going to be fingerprinted and photographed, doing all the booking largely on his own. And we're told, ABC's Surin Kim able to confirm that he's working with a local bail bondsman to put up the 10% of his $200,000 bond that he must post before he's allowed to leave.
And Aaron, I can imagine that's going to be the scene for quite some time. And based on what you said, he's certainly being treated as a defendant, basically someone who has been indicted like your average person. We want to check in now with Victor Okendo, who has been outside the Fulton County Jail for us. Victor, what is the scene like there now that the president is officially in town?
Hey, Stephanie, we are on the opposite side as to where Aaron is. This is another entrance to the Fulton County Jail right here. We've been here all day and watching this crowd closely. I can tell you right now, it goes up and down this street. The former president, no surprise, he has plenty of supporters here. I've heard from people who drove in from surrounding states, North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, but we've also heard from those who are eager to see the former president booked. One person telling me, I want to see the guy that tried to steal my vote go to jail. Today has not had that rally-like atmosphere. It might be for a few different reasons. Number one, space is absolutely limited. It's the media and the crowds. We're all on one side of the street, crammed in here. I can tell you, though, Stephanie, we've been out here since early this morning. Today, so far, it's been peaceful.
Well, that's certainly good to hear. And security, what is that like? We would imagine that it's pretty tight there. We know Aaron touched on that, security being really tight. But what are you seeing from your angle, your side of the jail?
Stephanie, security has been ramped up outside of the jail. There's a huge police presence out here, multiple agencies on the ground. You have state troopers, sheriff's offices, and you have police as well. And there were concerns about security surrounding today. A lot of that coming from the rhetoric from the former president. Of course, he is now barred from going after any witnesses on social media. But Trump and his allies, they called on their supporters to come out here today. And it's tough to put an exact number on it right now, Stephanie, but I put it at a couple hundred out here right now for the time being. And again, most importantly, everything so far today has gone smoothly.
Thank you so much, Victor. These are live images right now. You can see the former president's motorcade headed toward the Fulton County Jail, where he will be booked. A historic moment, Kim. The only former president for this to ever happen. I mean, what are the legal implications for him as he moves forward to try to run for president again?
Well, this is this weird combination of the law and politics happening at the same time. The evidence is quite formidable, and the charges are really serious. This has been going on since the January 6th committee. This information is not new. So for other defendants, this is a difficult case to sort of push back on the facts. And so really Trump's best defense is to wait it out till past November. And certainly if he wins the federal cases, the Mar-a-Lago case, the January 6th case filed by Special Counsel Jack Smith, he will be then, if he wins the presidency, in charge of the Justice Department. He can appoint an attorney general who will just make those cases go away, or he could attempt to pardon himself. It's trickier with this Georgia case because the federal government has no control over state prosecutors. They're their own sovereign. So I think this is a especially thorny one for Donald Trump for a number of reasons, not just because it's a little grittier, it's obviously humiliating, and it's not something that the federal side can have any impact and the election can have any impact. That being said, I think Americans, in a way, when they go to the polls, given that the case could either go away or not, are almost stepping into the shoes of jurors in a way. They're voting for whether there should be accountability for potentially, it looks like, very serious wrongdoing in the White House. If he gets reelected, maybe the answer is that's okay. We're going to go forward and let the president, whoever that is, cross boundaries, even if they're very serious, or say, you know what, we just don't want that and we want to shore up the Constitution. So it's weird how there's a kind of this combination of Constitution, legal trial, and then the politics of it all wrapped up in one. It's just astonishing.
It certainly is. It's complicated as well. We're looking at live images now. That is a shot from the motorcade. Now, this is a 30-minute drive from where the former president landed to the Fulton County Jail. And Kim, some may say, oh, this is all politics, but it isn't. This is the legal justice system at work. After 2.5 years of this probe, here we are. Talk a little bit about that. What do you think this is all about?
Yeah, I just started, I'm a law professor Monday with brand new law students, and there's a big difference between the legal system and the political system, and for good reason. Judges are bound by rules. They're bound by standards of evidence. The jury in these cases will not see a single witness or a single document unless the prosecutors are able to overcome these hurdles. Then the outcome can go on appeal. There's accountability at the higher echelons of the legal system, judges that go all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. In the political system, information travels around that's false, that spreads like wildfire. People believe it, and there's not really accountability. And one thing we've seen, I think, since Trump took office is that politicians don't really have the shame button anymore. It used to be that they'd be very careful about what they said because there'd be pushback politically, and now we're sort of used to it. So the legal system is kind of old-fashioned that way, and there's only a limit, really, to how political judges can be because the structure, the system is designed to be fair and focus on facts, verifiable facts, and established law. And even Donald Trump can't outmaneuver that politically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kim. I want to turn to former Georgia prosecutor Chris Timmons, who has worked on RICO cases in Georgia. He knows the setting and he knows many of these players involved. So, Chris, we are watching live pictures of Trump's motorcade right now from the motorcade. It should be another about 25 minutes or so until they get to the Fulton County Jail. it has a notorious reputation. And we heard from John Santucci mentioning some of those details. You know it well. What is the former president going to see when he steps inside this facility?
So it's interesting that the front of the jail is an administrative area, and you've got somebody like a receptionist in the front, and they're behind bulletproof glass, and they've got a kind of a window that they can speak through. So that area, though, is starkly furnished. It's just not very nice. Once you go through there, then he's not allowed to be with his attorneys anymore. He'll step toward the back. He'll get fingerprinted. He'll get his picture taken. But this is not the lobby of Mar-a-Lago. This is not the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton. This is the lobby of a jail. Not to be too disgusting, but people vomit in that area. So, I mean, it's a cement floor. It's not a nice space.
Now, District Attorney Fani Willis, she's requested an October 23rd trial date for all 19 co-defendants. Trump's attorneys are pushing back on this. I'm sure you've heard. How realistic would it be for Trump to stand trial in Georgia in just 2 months?
So it's an interesting question because there's two tensions here. One is you've got a judge who wants to get the trial over with. I mean, if he has to try this case 19 different times and you're talking about a potential of 1 year for each of those trials, you're looking at 19 years in a courtroom. That's just not realistic. The other tension on the other side, though, is that everybody's got a right to what's called effective assistance of counsel, meaning that you've got a right to a lawyer that knows the evidence in the case. You've got a right to a lawyer that knows what they're doing. And so the concern is if you force Donald Trump to go to trial on October 23rd with everybody else or anybody who's got the speedy trial demand pending, you could end up with what's referred to as an ineffective assistance of trial claim. If that's proven successfully that he received ineffective assistance of trial when that case goes to the Court of Appeals, then the case can be overturned. And that would certainly be embarrassing for a judge to have the Court of Appeals reverse him in what is going to be the trial of the century, if not the trial of the millennium.
Exactly. Let's talk a little bit about the broader legal strategy. So how significant is it that the judge set that date of October 23rd?
That he pushed it out about as far as he could. So when you have a speedy trial demand, and there's a couple different levels of speedy trial. There's the constitutional right that everybody knows they have a right to a speedy trial. But this is a statutory right in the state of Georgia, meaning that it's in our code. It's not in the Constitution. And so it's a unique law in that it says that you have to be tried within 2 terms of court. At the end of the day, so the term here, we're in the July term of court, which ends at the end of August. The speedy trial demand was filed during this term, which means it's either got to be tried during this term or next term. The next term ends on November 6th. So if Chesborough isn't tried, or at least the trial doesn't start before November 6th, statutorily, he has to be released. Statutorily, he will be acquitted. He will be not guilty. So the judge is facing that pressure. And so there's definitely going to be a trial in this case that starts on October 23rd, unless Chesborough does one of 2 things. Either 1, he withdraws his speedy trial demand, or 2, he enters a plea of some sort.
So there's a possibility for an acquittal. Now, let's talk about the defendants who are attorneys themselves. What are your expectations about whether some are going to make deals with prosecutors or even flip?
No, I expect every single one of the attorneys to go to trial unless they're towards the end of their career. I mean, I hate to say it even about myself, but when you're an attorney, it becomes a part of your identity. It's a part of your core being. And if you plead guilty to a RICO charge in the state of Georgia, a felony, you don't get to be a lawyer anymore. And that's like having a big portion of your personality ripped apart. I mean, you know, when I get introduced to people, they find out pretty quickly that I'm an attorney. If I plead guilty to RICO, I'm no longer an attorney, and so I'm searching for what sort of identity I have. And so I've did a lot of prosecution here in Georgia of high-profile individuals. In fact, some of those were attorneys. And those people tended to go to trial, even in cases where they knew they were going to be convicted, because they were just taking a chance that maybe, by some miracle, they'd be acquitted. It was so much more important to them to be able to raise their head high and claim that they did nothing wrong, but also to keep that law license, that they were willing to risk prison time. And in fact, some of them did go to prison rather than plead guilty and enter a plea that might get them probation. They wanted to keep that license. They wanted to keep that reputation. It's a very big deal to an attorney.
Thank you so much, Chris. Those attorneys certainly risking their careers and license. Thank you, Chris. You're looking, once again, if you're just joining us, you're looking at live images right now of the former president's motorcade making its way to the Fulton County Jail. The former president indicted for the 4th time, landing just a few moments ago from New Jersey, where he took off, landing there in Atlanta. Let's check in with Victor Okendo, who has been outside the Fulton County Jail for us. Victor, this is the former president's fourth indictment. You were there in Miami when he pled not guilty to federal charges that he illegally kept classified documents. How does Atlanta compare to that scene?
Good question, Stephanie. Totally different scenes, different atmosphere, different vibes. In Miami, outside of the courthouse there, the federal courthouse in downtown Miami, it honestly felt like a rally for the former president. You had music going, there were chants, you had people who brought their entire families by. It felt like an event. It has had a different feel out here today. Part of that might just be because the space here is so limited. Security has absolutely been tight. I mean, we are right on top of the line here with protesters and supporters as well. I should also mention, Stephanie, that beyond just, not having that music and the chants and all of that, it's taken on a little bit more of a somber tone here, and that might just be because of the seriousness of the situation today. Stephanie?
Thank you, Victor. And we are looking at the former president's motorcade as he approaches the Fulton County Jail, just a few minutes away, about 2 to 3 minutes away from that jail. Let's check in with ABC's Olivia Rubin. Olivia, even though the former president is being processed there today, there's already a court battle underway when it comes to the timeline of this case. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, honestly, Stephanie, it's sort of remarkable that, as you say, the former president has not been booked or entered a plea, but the legal filings in this case are, quite frankly, flying fast and furious. And we already, at this point today, have a trial date set, as we have mentioned, for one of the defendants. So already not even 2 weeks past when this indictment was filed, and we now have a trial date. So this case here in Georgia really is moving at a pace that we are not seeing in any of the other cases so far, quite frankly. And it's something that the former president likely does not want to hear. We have already seen his attorneys file pushing back on that October 23rd date that's been set just for now for one of the defendants in the case, saying that, quite frankly, they want nothing to do with any defendant who's looking for a speedy trial, and they're looking to push this far, far in advance, as we know that the former president's schedule often is. So we are already in a world where we could be looking at multiple trials in this case, and really a world where former President Trump is looking to delay as much as possible when his co-defendants are not looking to do the same thing.
And speaking of co-defendants, Olivia, we know that some of them, like Mark Meadows, have wanted to move the case from state court to federal court. Is the former president also expected to request the same?
We do expect that that's something that the former president would want to push for, and that would make him the fourth defendant already in this case to do so if he were to make that filing. So what we have here is a bunch of the defendants trying to move the case into federal court, and there is a very interesting reason that that might be helpful to them. So remember, even if the case moves to federal court, it would still be tried by the district attorney, Fonnie Willis, and it would still be under the state rules. However, if it is successfully moved to federal court, Stephanie, it changes the jury pool in a way that could significantly benefit former President Trump. His team seems to think, which is why it would be better for them to move it over.
Thank you, Olivia. Kim, let's talk a little bit more about this, the federal versus the state. Are there any benefits for Trump's team if this were to be moved to federal?
Yeah, it's an unusual motion, and the theory behind it is that Mark Meadows was working as a federal employee, a federal official, during this time. And there's a statute that Congress passed that said that you can take a case, a criminal case, from the state court and put it in federal court in theory, because Congress decided we don't want state prosecutors going after federal employees so they can't do their jobs while they're in the federal government. That's sort of the theory, but it hasn't been tested that much. And you have to have a federal issue to put it in federal court, but we would have a federal judge, so that federal judges have life tenure. They cannot be fired. They're not elected. So some people perceive that, and scholars will talk about whether that makes it a more neutral judge, number one. And as Olivia indicated, I think the jury's going to be really important here, because remember, Stephanie, everyone in this country is either voted for Donald Trump, voted against Donald Trump, or decided to stay home. So people are all, by definition, coming with potentially some bias or some preconceived notions of things. That's going to make it very difficult in all 4 of these cases to make sure there's an unbiased, fair jury for both sides.
Right, that may be difficult, the court of public opinion. Thanks, Kim. Here are live images. We just saw the former president arrive there at the Fulton County Jail in Georgia. We want to bring in John Katko, an ABC News contributor, as well as a former congressman and former assistant U.S. attorney. John, tell us, what do you make of all of this? The timing, this 4th indictment happening as this former president intends to run again for president?
Well, I think that this is going to be a unique experience for the president, especially because he is going to be mugshotted for the first time. And I can tell you, based on my 20 years of experience, especially with white-collar criminals, that has a profound effect on the individual as well as the public at large. And to see that photo out there and to see that whole thing happening, it's going to be an interesting dynamic. And it's going to be quite different for the president, but also I think it's going to be quite different for the public. And then you got to start seeing how they react to it and how this is going to happen. It's going to be fascinating.
It certainly is. And you've stressed throughout all of this, throughout this case, the severity of the charges. Do you think that it's sinking in for the former president right now that he's at the jail, that this is actually happening? Do you think it's sinking in, the severity of these charges?
Well, if it isn't, he's not human. I'm positive that it's sinking in for him. It sinks in for everybody. And I think this is going to have one of those, it's going to be kind of a watershed moment for him as an individual. Another thing I thought of when I heard you talking earlier about him firing his attorney and replacing with someone else and all that. This president is used to, I think I've seen statistics, more than 1,000 lawsuits that he's been involved in. And those are civil lawsuits. That's a very, very, very different dynamic than a criminal lawsuit. And, you know, dispensing with your criminal defense attorney here and there because you don't like what you're hearing is not the same as a civil case. And so I think that there's a lot that I'm sure the former president is processing right now. And this is going to be a profoundly impactful moment for him tonight. If you look at the images, for example, of Rudy Giuliani, he came out of the courtroom after being arraigned and a lot of bravado. That mugshot didn't look like bravado. And I think the same can be said for Mark Meadows. You know, those pictures tell 1,000 words, and I think they're going to with him too. And I think this could be a very impactful moment for him in a way that he's never experienced before. He has to go through the indignity of being weighed, of being fingerprinted, which he has in the past, but not weighed, and then his picture taken and with a mugshot with a number under him. That's a very different dynamic for someone like him, and especially since he was a former president of the United States of America. So this could have a very profound impact on him for sure.
Well, thank you so much. We want to check in now with Victor Oquendo, who has been outside the Fulton County Jail. Victor, we saw the motorcade go by, but did he go by where you are, exactly where those supporters are? Did he get a chance to see them?
So, Stephanie, unfortunately for all the supporters that have been here all day long, we're talking about probably a couple hundred of them, the former president actually went by another entrance in his motorcade. We are at another entrance here to the Fulton County Jail. It does appear like they went to the other side, and now the question is, as the former president likely goes inside the jail, is what will the exit route be? Because these people have been lined up all day, not just to show their support, but also to get a glimpse of the former president. Again, everyone right now, Stephanie, they're just waiting to see what is going to happen next, and we're trying to figure it out ourselves.
I hear you, Victor. Thank you so much. You're looking at live images right there outside the Fulton County Jail, where the former president has just arrived a few minutes ago to get, as you've heard from our contributors, to get fingerprinted, weighed, photographed. We want to check in with ABC's Olivia Rubin. Olivia, even though the former president is being processed there today, tell us about this timeline, how we've seen this all play out. We know this was a 2.5-year process. The former president has been indicted now 4 times. What about a pardon? Could that be on the table?
Well, the pardon, Stephanie, and I know I keep saying that Georgia has these really different laws and the way it's working here is very different, but that is especially true in terms of the pardon process here in Georgia. Now, of course, there's the main reason that these are state charges, so the presidential pardon power would not work here for President Trump to pardon himself or anyone else. But also here in Georgia, the governor actually does not have any pardon power like other states. So even if Trump had a good relationship with the governor here, Brian Kemp, which by all indications they do not, they very publicly trade attacks on each other. Even if they had a good relationship, Kemp would not be able to give the former president a pardon if he were to want to give him one. But here in Georgia, actually, to sort of add on to the list here, the pardons are done by this independent board where people are appointed. They serve out their terms on this board, but yet you cannot be eligible for a pardon here in Georgia unless you are 5 years out of your sentence that you have been given here, Stephanie. So none of those things are something that the former president wants to hear in this case, because that really would mean that he would have to be convicted, sentenced, serve his sentence, wait 5 years, and then apply for a pardon here in Georgia. So all of those factors really stacking against the former president here and not what he wants to hear.
Not at all. That certainly doesn't work in his favor. Olivia, thank you. I want to bring back in John Katko. John, has the former president, in your opinion, been treated any differently? We know he was tweeting earlier today on his social media platform, hyping up the surrender. But does that violate, for instance, his release condition by any means? Is he being treated any differently?
Oh, he's clearly being treated differently, and I don't have much quarrel with that. But when I was doing RICO cases, and I did probably half a dozen major RICO cases, we didn't give the option for individuals to turn themselves in. And we did roundups and brought them in and had them sit in a courtroom and then were arraigned when they were in handcuffs. He's not going through that. And, you know, under other circumstances, I think it's the right thing to do. But, you know, this is a very different type of RICO case, but it's also garden variety in some respects, because when I did political corruption cases and police corruption cases, sometimes you're a little bit different based on the circumstances. This one, yeah, he is being treated differently, but in the greater scheme of things, I don't think it's that big a deal. I still think it's incredibly impactful, and I think the case is very, very serious.
Right, and you have decades of experience working RICO cases. What are some of your expectations about these co-defendants possibly flipping on the former president?
Well, I've never done a racketeering case where one or more co-defendants didn't plead and cooperate. And it's kind of like I used to say to a jury, if you want to talk to a baker or learn how bread is baked, you talk to a baker, right? If you want to learn how a racketeering enterprise works, talk to one of the members. And here's one of the members who's pled guilty, said this racketeering enterprise existed, and that was a part of it, and so was this guy on trial. That's very, very impactful. And I would find it hard to believe that given the 5-year mandatory minimum sentences that are going to be meted out here as a minimum, that one or more of these defendants will not plead guilty and cooperate to try and avoid the jail time. And that, in addition to all the other evidence out there, can be incredibly impactful to a jury. And I said earlier in an earlier appearance, a RICO case is like a ball rolling downhill. You keep hearing day after day all this evidence coming in and all this evidence coming in. If you have all that evidence coming in and then you have people that were involved in it saying this happened, that is incredibly impactful. So it's, you know, anybody who goes to trial in a case like this is really rolling the dice.
So many implications, so many charges. The former president now facing charges in 4 different cases. In addition to running for president, let's talk a little bit about the legal calendar here. How does the legal calendar even work in a situation like this?
Well, we're talking, it would be a mess with one criminal trial. You're talking about 4 separate and distinct criminal trials on both the federal and state levels. I have no clue how they can possibly balance all of this and how a campaign can be run as well. It's we're in really uncharted territories here. And I've prosecuted probably thousands of defendants. I've never seen a defendant with this many different charges in different jurisdictions pending all at the same time. And on top of that, having a public career as well. So it's pretty significant.
Certainly historic, John. Thank you. We want to welcome back Olivia Rubin. The former president will go in for processing, including taking a mugshot. We know he arrived there at the Fulton County Jail just a few moments ago. Talk to us about the process he'll go through before that photo is released to the public.
Well, if we take the previous defendants that have surrendered here as any indication on what the former president will go through, it's that he is going to get this mugshot first. There have been defendants who have released their mugshot, publicly on their own social media profiles before the sheriff's office has officially put them out, as the office usually does. So the former president is going to see this mugshot first himself. And I can say that, having everyone see it, that's one thing. But I think that's going to be a real moment for the former president when he first gets to see this image. Now, publicly, of course, we can expect that the campaign, because he is a candidate for 2024, is going to use this as their best new campaign tool. I was speaking to a source close to the former president recently, and I said, what about the mugshot? Is that embarrassing when that comes out? How is that going to be, play out? And this person said, well, that's our best campaign tool. I'm going to make $5 million selling T-shirts with that mugshot. So that's going to be the public messaging around the mugshot. Come get your Trump mugshot T-shirt and mugs. But I can say, just having been in these sort of rooms previously when the president has been arraigned, I was there the previous 2 times, and of course it was a different situation. It was at a courthouse, not at a jail. But privately, Stephanie, when the former president is in this situation, it is a difficult situation for him when he is in the courtroom, when the cameras are turned off, when he is not the campaign man, but rather a defendant in these situations. It does appear to weigh on him. And I've described this before, how he, looks at the floor, how he is reserved. He says very little. Sometimes he doesn't even enter his own plea on his own behalf. So it's a very different contrast to the president that we see inside of the courtroom, or that we won't see inside of the jail, to the public perception that we see and what the campaign puts out.
Thank you so much, Olivia. You've been there for so many different arraignments, and of course you've seen his demeanor, and it's certainly a different situation there being at the Fulton County Jail. Thank you, Olivia. Kim, what do you make of the legal shakeup? We spoke about this a few moments ago, how former President Trump switched lawyers just hours before surrendering. What does that tell you about his game plan just hours before showing up in Atlanta?
Well, reportedly, he doesn't like to lose, and he blames lawyers if they lose things. Rudy Giuliani apparently asked recently, or his son asked to have his fees reimbursed, and one of the conversations reportedly was, listen, you didn't get me what I wanted. And I think that's the instinct. His first lawyer, both of these lawyers, the former one and the new one, have experience with high-profile cases, have represented people who are in, celebrities. So I think that the public-facing component of this defense is going to be very important for Donald Trump, not necessarily for an anonymous defendant. But that being said, the former lawyer filed some really big motions trying to get Fani Willis thrown off the case, trying to get evidence taken out of the case, and lost. So, it's probably a psychological thing in part with Donald Trump. I'm sure both of these are excellent lawyers. But this idea, wait a minute, maybe if I just switch my team out, I'll start getting some results. And that's not how the law works. All lawyers are bound by the evidence, and they're bound by the law, and they're bound by the rules. And there's definitely strategy, particularly when you're in front of a jury. There's personalities and how you weave the theory of the case. That being said, when it comes to legal motions, getting things thrown out, it's really hard to make magic when there's not a lot of there. Although I think we will see additional motions in all 4 cases trying to get pieces of the case thrown out or evidence thrown out, constitutional arguments relating to him being president, the First Amendment, et cetera. Those can, at a minimum, buy some time, because the really important issues relating to the Constitution, for example, could go all the way to the Supreme Court before we have a trial. And I think that alone would be a win for the Trump defense team.
Let's talk about other co-defendants trying to make some of those changes, trying to make some magic. Mark Meadows, who's also charged in this, filed a motion seeking to move his Fulton County case to federal court. What do you think would be the motivation behind that?
Well, you're going from a completely different court system to another court system. State court to federal court, different rules apply, different procedural rules, the federal rules of criminal procedure versus the Georgia rules. It would be the same underlying criminal counts, but you'd get a federal judge. Federal judges are there for life. They're perceived as a little sort of, sometimes more independent and neutral. And then the jury pool would be the federal district, not just that particular local district. And so the jury, if he gets one juror that decides, I just don't think it's okay to treat a former president this way, or this is my person, right? I'm a MAGA supporter, or I'm a Republican, or I don't like what this is doing for the country, and that doesn't come out in the discussion, what they call voir dire, where you have a communication with potential jurors. If that doesn't come out, then there would be a hung jury, and it would be up to the government to decide whether to try him again. But again, that could be a win. So there's those kinds of strategic decisions. But one thing's for sure, Stephanie, this is really expensive for each of these defendants. Lawyers are really, really, really expensive. And it's not just the lead lawyer. There will be junior lawyers. There will be paralegals. There will be investigators. Unfortunately, in the American system, people with wealth do get better justice if they're criminal defendants, and they're more able to defend and bring cases in the civil side. And not everyone in this case has tremendous wealth. And as Congressman Katko mentioned earlier, there will be some incentives, I think, for people to get some kind of agreement, cooperation agreement, so they can stop the bleeding financially and move on with their lives.
I want to recap exactly why this happened in Georgia, right? We know that the former president had some sort of an obsession with Georgia, claimed 5,000 people, dead people voted, obsessed with a suitcase full of ballots, said poll workers, too, specifically, who were actually witnesses before the select committee. Trump claimed they were part of a scheme. So we know that this is the former president's fourth indictment on charges related to efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. We now know that the former president has been booked and released. That is coming from the Fulton County Jail's Sheriff's Office. The former president has now been booked and released. Kim, is there anything that stood out to you within this case, within this fourth indictment, given all of these claims that the former president made relating to Georgia?
There are two parts of the indictment that really struck me. They aren't related to the charges specifically against Donald Trump, although that's arguably part of the RICO, the racketeering. One has to do with the intimidation of election workers. We saw two of them, mother and daughter, who spoke to the United States Congress and have said their lives have been ruined. These are regular people. And election workers in America, a lot of them are just volunteers. They're your friends, their neighbors. These are people that do their civic duty for the rest of us to make our elections work. And they were threatened and intimidated and had tremendous impact, negative impact in their lives. The other piece has to do with Coffee County, and the ballots and the machinery in Coffee County. Allegedly, there were some attempts for some of these defendants to tamper with that machinery. And what's striking to me about that was, of course, this was a lot of what Donald Trump has been saying since the election, that, there's been, messing with the machines. Of course, Fox News lost a huge defamation case, or I should say they settled it for hundreds of millions of dollars around that. And I think that just gets to the heart of our electoral process. It's almost like he claimed there was all this fraud, and now the people within his circle are accused of actually messing with the machinery. And I think that's something that Americans inherently understand is not okay. So those are the pieces I don't think we saw so far in the January 6th case, which is much narrower and much more discreet in terms of what the federal government decided to do about that whole narrative leading up to that horrible day.
Took years to get here, but here we are. Let's check in with Victor Okendo, who is outside the Fulton County Jail. As we just mentioned, the former president, Donald Trump, has been booked and released from the Fulton County Jail there in Georgia. That is per the sheriff's office. A senior advisor to the former president tells ABC News that a mugshot was taken of Trump moments after entering the Fulton County Jail. Again, let's check in with Victor Okendo, who has been outside the jail for us. Victor, what is happening there right now?
So, Stephanie, now that the former president has been booked and released, everyone out here who's been waiting all day is trying to figure out if his motorcade will be driving by our side of the jail here, right outside this entrance to the Fulton County Prison. I can tell you that there are plenty of supporters here of the former president. There are plenty of signs that say Trump won, but at the same time, there are plenty of people who are eager to see that mugshot, see the former president booked. One sign just made its way down that way saying, "Lock up Trump in Georgia, my vote counts." Just take a look behind me here. You got a mix of supporters, those pro and against Trump. You know, you've got this sign back here. Hold that up for me, sir, if you could. It says, "No one is above the law," and right in front of him, this guy holding up his "Make America Great Again" hat. Where are you from, sir?
I'm from Laverne, California, just outside of LA.
You're outside of. Did you come here just for this today?
Yeah, my friend has a Dilly show, Brendan Dilly, and I came to do some shows with him. We talk politics, but yeah, I came to be here. I was here. I love Rudy Giuliani, so I came to support him, and then today President Trump.
That's a long way to come.
I love my president, man. All are welcome on the Trump train, man. I mean, people try to racially divide us through all kinds of things. It's for everybody. You see the blacks for Trump, you see everybody. My boy here, we love President Trump. So we appreciate you being out here, although we didn't get to see him.
Gotcha. And what about for you? You're holding that sign up there that says "No one is above the law." Are you here from Atlanta?
Absolutely. And no one is above the law.
And why was it so important for you to be out here?
I think equal representation all the way around. This is what America's about. We all show up. We agree to disagree, and we're civil about it, right?
It's a love fest, bro.
Amen. Thank you guys very much. Last thing I'll say, Stephanie, is you can take away from this interaction here, everything has been peaceful today. Send it back to you.
That's good to hear, Victor. We are looking at live images now of the former president leaving the Fulton County Jail. You can see escorted there by police. His motorcade is now leaving. And just a few moments ago, we told you the former president was booked. His mugshot was taken, and he is now heading back to the airport as he boards his plane to head back to Bedminster, New Jersey. Kim, let's talk about the those who say this is political. This has been years in the making. Why not just let this go? Talk about that, how it's those who say this is the legal system at work, the justice system at work, versus those who say this is just political. Let it go.
You know, it's hard to not be sympathetic to that argument because we have a big election coming in a year. And of course, we're a more divided political country than ever. We're very polarized, and we tend to sort of sort people blue versus red, almost like a team mentality. But you have to think about the Constitution and this whole rule of law. People talk about upholding the rule of law, like a speed limit when you're driving down the street, right? The sign could say 35 miles an hour, but you'll blow through it and go 45 or 50 if there's no ticket. One day you do it, and there's a machine hiding in the bushes, and you get that ticket in the mail, and then everyone's going to slow down the next time after getting that ticket. That's really why this isn't so much political. If you swapped out Donald Trump and you put a Democrat, or you put some other person that maybe you're not that excited about in that position, you have to understand, if there are no tickets for speeding through the Constitution becomes irrelevant. That's why the implications are so profound, not just for Donald Trump, who, of course, this is an extremely difficult day for him and his family. It's humiliating. He could actually in theory, go to jail. That's the difference between a criminal case and a civil case. That's just money. This is talking about your liberty. But it really is about saying, you know what? The Constitution matters in this country. We want there to be consequences for blowing through some of the stop signs.
Let's talk about pardons. Does that play a role in all of this? Is that an option for him? And if so, Why in a case like this?
Yeah, the pardon power is this strange thing that actually dates back to common law monarchies, even before that. The original pardon was Barabbas and Jesus, right, before the crucifixion. And the theory is really that the person in charge, the governor, not in Georgia, or the president, should be able to have mercy for certain people. That it's really a mercy lever, that the criminal justice system is so unfair for some people that you should just sort of waive that process. And in common law England, there weren't a lot of rules for criminal defendants. The other use of pardons is for just after a war or to sort of make some peace. We saw this with Gerald Ford and President Nixon. So it's sort of looming out there as this weird, arcane kind of historical artifact. But for Donald Trump, at the federal level, those two huge cases, if he's president again, there are very few limits on the constitutional pardon power. He can make those go away. This one, not so much, which is, I think, why this is, for lots of reasons, such a heavy prospect for the former president.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about the bigger implications on the Constitution. What are they?
Well, as you know, the Constitution, again, I like to talk about common law England. And if you imagine a king, the idea is the power comes from God, and it's like a triangle like this, and the king hands out favors. In America, it's the opposite. The triangle is upside down. The power comes from the people, and then it goes to our elected officials. So I think we've gotten that a little bit mixed up in the last few years, the idea being that somehow there's some entitlement for certain people to have power. I really think we need to see accountability for something this serious. Disruption of the peaceful transition of power from one president to another. People died on that day. A lot of people were injured. Potentially tampering with voting machines, filing fake slates of electors, trying to dupe the United States Congress, to dupe secretaries of state, to basically dupe the voters. If we say, thumbs up, that's no problem for certain people, then we're moving that triangle, again, the upside triangle, where we're the boss. We're flipping that, and we're creating something that looks more like an unlimited monarchy, where in theory the power came from God. The power didn't come from the people. That's the innovation of the framers of the United States Constitution. The people are the ones in charge. And I really think these efforts by various prosecutors at various levels, they're not all answering to the same one superior, except to the extent to which it's functioning as a democracy, and their bosses are the United States citizenry.
The U.S. Constitution and the legal system at work. Thank you so much, Kim. The former president facing 13 state charges. You can see there live images from his motorcade as the former president heads back to the airport to then make his way back to New Jersey. I'm just going to read off some of the charges that he is facing. Former President Trump is facing conspiracy to commit filing false documents, false statements in writing, solicitation of violation of oath by public officer, and many more. 13 state charges in total. If you are just joining us, former President Donald Trump has been booked and released from the Fulton County Jail. That is from the sheriff's office. A senior advisor to the former president tells ABC News that a mugshot was taken of Trump moments after entering the Fulton County Jail. The motorcade right now is on the way to the airport, where he will board his private plane and head back to Bedminster, New Jersey. Now, in this case, the president's own words being used against him. Take a listen.
All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
What I knew is that we didn't have any votes to find. We had continued to look. We investigated, like I just shared the numbers with you. There were no votes to find. That was an accurate count that had been certified.
Let's go back to John Katko, an ABC News contributor, as well as a former congressman and former assistant U.S. attorney. John, all of this comes as the 8 other candidates for the Republican nomination squared off last night on stage without the former president, without Trump. Each one of them was asked if they would still support Trump if convicted. Take a listen.
You all signed a pledge to support the eventual Republican nominee. If former President Trump is convicted in a court of law, would you still support him as your party's choice? please raise your hand if you would. Just
all of them except one, right?
So just to be clear, Governor Christie, you were kind of late to the game there, but you raised your hand?
No, I'm doing this. Look, I'm doing this.
And
not
I know
this.
you didn't.
Whoa. No.
What's
and
the
look, here's the bottom line. Someone's got to stop normalizing this conduct. Okay? Now whether or not you believe that the criminal charges are right or wrong,
you're amazing.
the conduct is beneath the office of President of the United States.
John, what did you make of that last night?
Well, I think his comments are correct. I think that there's a remarkable phenomenon going on here with respect to this president where former president, he can do no wrong in the eyes of his supporters. And his comment when he was on the election trail way back when he said, I could kill someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and I'd still have the support of all these people. It's probably right to some extent. But I do think that at some point, there's part of that base that is going to start rethinking their options. And what last night provided us was a glimpse into someone who might be able to fill that vacuum. And quite frankly, the bench is pretty deep on the Republican side, and I think that there's several that could fill that vacuum. They're nowhere near being able to achieve that goal, but it is certainly still a possibility with all this floating over the former president's head. And like I said earlier, mugshots sometimes have a profound impact on the community when they see it, and that might be something that gets people to start thinking in a different manner as well, because it makes it much more real seeing someone's mugshot. So there's a lot more to go here, and I think this election is far from over. And I remember back in 2015, someone by the name of Donald Trump was in the single digits at this time and caught fire later on and became a juggernaut. So you never know. We're in very, very uncharted territories here. And being the first ex-president in history of our great country over 250 years that has been charged with a crime, let alone multiple crimes. So there's a long way to go. And last night was probably a necessary step in that direction.
We certainly do have a long way to go, but a historic night there in Fulton County, Georgia. We're looking at live images, John, of the former president's motorcade. We want to bring in John Santucci. John, the president is on his way back to the airport right now. And I understand you have some reporting about how Trump was able to be processed that quickly?
Yeah, Stephanie, my understanding is that in order to speed up this process, former President Trump was allowed to self-report his height and weight. That is different than any other of the 18 defendants that were charged alongside Trump. They had to go through the normal process, if you will, for surrendering at the Fulton County Jail. But Donald Trump, in order to get him in and out as quickly as possible, I am told was able to self-report those details just to speed up the process. Obviously, having Donald Trump there, we saw that motorcade basically take over the jail and the streets surrounding it. Any way to get him in and out, that was definitely the goal, not only for the Fulton County Sheriff, but also the Secret Service, Stephanie.
And John, I would imagine after taking that mugshot and seeing that mugshot, the severity of the charges has to sink in. What are you hearing about the former president's mood tonight, if you're hearing about it at all?
You know, many people at the moment waiting to get back to the aircraft with Donald Trump. I don't believe they've actually connected with him, is my understanding, just yet, Stephanie. And, you know, you mentioned seeing that mugshot. I'm unclear, Stephanie, if Donald Trump has actually seen the mugshot yet. It's my understanding his aides will at some point get the mugshot. I don't believe they have it yet, based on the folks that I'm speaking to in real time. But you've got to imagine that Donald Trump, who's always very attentive to detail, always wants to make sure he looks great, always wants to review a photo. That is not the way things work. I'd be surprised if they spun the monitor around. So, Mr. President, what do you think? Should we take it again? That is something that Donald Trump probably wanted. I'm not sure he got that tonight, Stephanie.
Probably not. Thank you, John. Let's check in again with Aaron Katersky. Aaron, let's talk about what just happened to the former president inside that jail. What were those moments like for you as you stand out there outside the jail?
The former president was in and out of this jail, Stephanie, in under a half an hour. And in that time, he was booked and processed, meaning his height and weight were recorded. As John notes, that was entered by his team earlier than planned. And then he was fingerprinted and his first mugshot was taken. The whole process did not last very long, certainly a lot faster than the usual criminal defendant here. But he went through all the steps. And then as his motorcade left, Stephanie, it appeared that the former president flashed a thumbs up on his way back to the airport.
And Aaron, as you know, this has been a marathon week in Fulton County following the indictment of the former president and 18 others, as the defendants have been negotiating their bonds, surrendering and challenging the case in court. Now, we have some of the pre-negotiated bond packages here. For Rudy Giuliani, $150,000. And we understand the former president had to post a $200,000 bail. We're learning about how he went about getting some of that money. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
The former president was required to post bond. The first time in all 4 of his criminal prosecutions that he's been asked to post bond. And here in Georgia, it was required that he put up 10%. And to do that, we're told he worked with a local bail bondsman to secure the money, get it posted before he was ultimately released. That must have been prearranged because, again, he wasn't in there very long. Other defendants have been able to also prearrange the terms of their bond, except one. There is one defendant, Floyd is his name, who was accused of coming here and trying to strong-arm one of the poll workers who had been falsely accused of stealing ballots. He did not prearrange his bond, so he's spending the night here at the Fulton County Jail.
Absolutely incredible. Aaron, thank you. Let's bring in our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas. Pierre, after 4 indictments and now this 4th surrender by a former U.S. president, what are your initial reactions to what we just witnessed?
Well, none of this is supposed to happen. You're not supposed to see a former president walking into a jail as a criminal defendant. That's the thing that's striking. And also, I would use the word severe. When you go into a jail, and I have had the unfortunate ability because of my job to go into jails, they're not pleasant places at all. And this particular jail that former President Trump went into has a notorious reputation for being poorly run, dangerous, and quite frankly, just disgusting. And so the word severity comes to mind. The other thing that comes to mind is that the former president has now been accused by 4 different prosecutors, in 4 different cases has been accused of criminal acts. Again, just extraordinary. You have the prosecutor in New York. You have the special counsel with 2 separate cases targeting the president. And now you have the Fulton County DA targeting a former president of the United States, basically accusing him of crimes. Now, we'll have to see if this case can be won in court by the prosecutors. But it's not lost on any of us. And there's a feeling of this becoming routine to some degree because this is the 4th time that we've seen it. But on the other hand, when you really think about what is taking place, we may, in a few weeks' time, in a live broadcast, see a former president at an arraignment live, the first time the world would ever see a former president in court live.
Absolutely historic, Pierre. You said it. Extraordinary that we are witnessing this. A historic night indeed. Let's bring back in former Georgia prosecutor Chris Timmons. Chris, we know the former president's bond agreement has a provision against making any direct or indirect threats toward co-defendants or witnesses. How closely will authorities be watching in Georgia, watching him after this appearance today? And I just briefly want to mention that we are now watching the former president's motorcade make its way to the tarmac there in Georgia. But what do you make of this?
So, I mean, it doesn't have to be the prosecutors watching it. It's the entire world media that's watching Donald Trump, waiting for him to put something on Truth Social or to say something. And so the prosecution's going to be aware the second that he does it. The question is, are they going to file a motion to revoke his bond? So the process is you have what could be an alleged violation of the bond. The state files a motion to revoke the bond. The judge sets a hearing where the defendant is present. The state has to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the defendant has violated his bond condition. And if they prove that, then he goes either back into jail or maybe house arrest, but he'll be confined in some way.
And that would be another incredible and remarkable moment. Right now, we're watching live images as the former president is stepping out of the motorcade. You can see the camera moving there just a bit. Now, I want to ask you, we know that the former president has had so many different lawyers working for him and had another legal shakeup just today. What do you make of bringing in a new defense attorney on the day of his surrender?
So it's interesting. I mean, Jennifer Little, who's the attorney that's staying on, actually, I've known her for years. When she was a law student in 2004, she was my intern, believe it or not, at a prosecution office. But he's got Jennifer Little for some continuity. It's interesting that, Jude Findling went away and that he brought in Steve Sadow. My guess would be, without knowing for sure, is that Findling was a little low-key for the president. Steve Sadow is the type of lawyer who likes to pound his chest, talk about how he's going to destroy you in court. And I think that might be what the former president is looking for, is a chest pounder, somebody who's going to threaten. Steve Sadow does martial arts as one of his hobbies. If you go to lunch with Steve, he's got a very big ego. The entire lunch will be spent talking about Steve Sadow. So that really interesting thing here is going to be the tension that's going to be between two people who want the spotlight. And so that's my only concern. I would be concerned that the former president might fire Mr. Sadow because he doesn't want to share the spotlight or even be upstaged.
Let's talk about how expensive this can get. There's a lot of money involved in all of this. We know Rudy Giuliani was requesting some of his fees to be paid, and the former president is now defending himself in 4 cases. We know the legal bills have to be mounting up. Can you give us a sense for just how expensive this type of representation can be?
So I actually had, in a RICO case that I prosecuted that was only going to go to trial for a month, but given the ramp up on a RICO case, probably 9 months to prepare for, one of the defense attorneys indicated in open court that it was going to be approximately $1 million just for him. So in this particular case, where you're talking about a trial where jury selection is going to last a long time, looking at the YSL or Young Thug case here, which started in January and is still ongoing with regard to jury selection, this is going to be a long jury selection. This is going to be a long trial. So what you're saying to an attorney is you've got to shut down your entire practice. You can't handle any other cases during the next year or 2. And so when they're setting the amount, and it's the amount that not only that they're taking home, but also the amount to pay rent, to pay their staff, et cetera, it's probably $1 million or $2 million in fees when you get down to it, at the very least.
An expensive and lengthy process. Thank you so much, Chris. Let's go to ABC's Olivia Rubin now. The president, Olivia, is about to get on his plane, heading back to New Jersey. Can you tell us a little bit about what may be happening next?
Well, the former president is now leaving Atlanta, but really the case is just getting underway here in earnest with multiple dates already set.
Sorry, Olivia, we're going to interrupt you for just a second. The former president.
Election, you should be able to challenge an election. I thought the election was a rigged election, a stolen election, and I should have every right to do that. As you know, you have many people that you've been watching over the years do the same thing, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Stacey Abrams or many others. When you have that great freedom to challenge, you have to be able to, otherwise you're going to have very dishonest elections. What has taken place here is a travesty of justice. We did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong. And everybody knows it. I've never had such support. And that goes with the other ones, too. What they're doing is election interference. They're trying to interfere with an election. There's never been anything like it in our country before. This is their way of campaigning. And this is one instance, but you have 3 other instances. It's election interference. So I want to thank you for being here. We did nothing wrong at all, and we have every right, every single right, to challenge an election that we think is dishonest, that we think it's very dishonest. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you very soon. Thank you very much.
Want to bring in John Santucci. You heard the president there calling the 2020 election rigged again. What do you make of those comments?
Comments we're going to hear every day for the next year plus. That is the Donald Trump campaign slogan. Obviously, he goes out there and says, "Make America Great Again," but it's quickly followed by rigged, stolen election. And that is really the Donald Trump mantra right now. It's shocking that, elections are about moving things forward. Donald Trump is still living in November 2020, and we know that is something that still sticks with him. And clearly seeing Donald Trump come to cameras and defending himself, but nevertheless looking backwards, not looking forward to, we're going to beat this case, whatever else. I mean, he can't let it go. And it jives very much, Stephanie, what I was being told on January 6, 2021, as people were telling me in real time, he just still can't believe and accept the fact he lost. Nearly 2.5 years later, that sentiment quite clearly, based on those remarks, still exists front and center for Donald Trump.
They certainly do. I want to check in with Olivia Rubin now. Olivia, you heard the president there once again calling the 2020 election rigged, thanking his supporters, but also saying that he did nothing wrong, also bringing up Hillary Clinton, Stacey Abrams. We know there's no evidence to what he is saying, that it is not true, but still repeating those same lines, saying that it was a stolen election, despite there being no evidence. Olivia, what do you make of all of this?
Well, we also heard the former president say, Stephanie, something that's very key that we've heard from him in relation to all of the election cases, which is that he had a right to challenge the election, which he thought had fraud in it. And that is a defense that we have started to hear emerge from multiple of the defendants in this case who have spoken thus far. You think about Rudy Giuliani. When he came to surrender at the jail yesterday, he said, "I had every right to give the president advice as an attorney." That's the same defense that we heard from John Eastman when he came to the jail. So far, what we are hearing from these defendants as they are coming to surrender is sort of this similar line that they had the right to challenge the election because they thought it was fraudulent. So now it will be on the prosecutors to show that that was actually criminal conduct, but a clear sort of solid line drawn now between the former president and many of his closest allies that are ensnared in this investigation, that they are clearly publicly on the same page with this.
They certainly seem to be. Olivia, thank you so much. Again, a reminder to our viewers that despite what the president said just a few moments ago, there has been no evidence to prove his claim that there was any election irregularities that would have changed the result of the election. I want to bring in Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas. Pierre, you just heard the president there a few moments ago, sticking with the same lines, defending himself, but also saying that the election, despite there being no evidence, was stolen. What do you make of it?
Well, Stephanie, here's the bottom line. One of the main accusations by the Fulton County prosecutor and the special counsel is that former President Trump had every right to litigate his claim that the election was rigged. There were 61 court cases. He lost every one of them. And the reason why he lost every one of them, based on the facts, is that there simply was not wide-scale election fraud. It does not exist. It did not exist, and certainly not enough to overturn the election. Those are just facts. And what this case boils down to is once that became known to he and the people around him, the question is, did their actions then morph into something that was illegal? By going to the vice president and saying, stop the certification of Joe Biden. That's an official proceeding which the Constitution allows for the selection of the president. Did it morph into something that was illegal? But this whole notion of a rigged election, I think we owe it to our viewers to just make it clear at every turn, at every chance where the election was checked, the bottom line is this has been viewed as one of the safest, most secure elections in U.S. history. And Republican officials, remember, Mr. Raffensperger is a Republican official. That's who he was calling, asking for 11,780 votes. And these officials in Michigan, in the various battleground states, Arizona, told the president and his people around him, you lost the election, sir.
Pierre Thomas for us in Washington. Thank you so much, Pierre. I want to bring in Asha Rangappa, an ABC News legal contributor and former associate dean of the Yale Law School. Asha, everyone is going to be waiting for this mugshot of the former president, but Can you put it into context for us, the significance of an image like this? We know it's extraordinary and it's historic, but talk about the significance and which, I mean, this hasn't existed before. We haven't seen this before.
No, you know, when you look back historically to, for example, former President Richard Nixon, and when President Ford pardoned him, I mean, one of the calculations that President Ford took into account was the trauma and the, humiliation basically for the country as a whole to watch a former president go through the process of being criminally prosecuted. That was one of the considerations that he took into account. And we now see why. I mean, it's, we've now gone through this 3 times. This is the 4th time, but this will be much more powerful because we are going to have that very iconic image that we know from cultural and, TV and all of these different areas of what it means for someone to actually be a part of the criminal justice system. And this is, I think, it's a low for the country, I think, not something that we should be proud of, at least to the extent that this is happening, though, it does emphasize that no one is above the law.
And in speaking with John Santucci, we heard from him earlier about the mugshot and how it would likely be used to try and promote the former president as he moves toward this next election. I want to hear your take on the legal shakeup that took place today with Trump's legal team. What does it say about the case of an indicted individual when they change their legal representation the same day of their surrender?
Well, with former President Trump, it's really hard to know. I mean, we saw this through his administration. We just saw him getting rid of people and bringing people in. And since he has encountered all of these legal difficulties, he's cycled through a number of different lawyers. So it's not always clear what is driving it. Is he asking them to do things that they don't want to do? Does he just want someone who, has more star power? I mean, we don't know. I will say that from what I understand, the lawyer that he's hired, and in fact, the one that he let go, are highly reputable. So he has very good counsel, and he really needs that in this kind of complex criminal prosecution. I think the challenge is he going to listen to their counsel? And I think that the problem with Trump that we've seen over the years is that he's a terrible client. I think as a lawyer, he must be a very frustrating client because he doesn't always follow, I think, your standard legal advice, for example, to remain silent. And we'll just, I guess, have to see how long this particular lawyer will last. But I think in this case, at least, as opposed to the people that he's been indicted with, many of whom are his former lawyers, this person that he's hired does seem to be very good for at least the substance of this case.
And Alisha, I want to talk about the bond restrictions, but before we do that, I do want to remind our viewers that we are looking at live images right now as the former president's plane takes off from Atlanta to Bedminster. This is moments after being booked and released there at the Fulton County Jail. Now, Alisha, talk about the bond restrictions the former president is facing, specifically not threatening witnesses or co-defendants. We know that he does have a tendency to lash out on various platforms. Do you see this as a significant risk?
I do see this as a significant risk, especially in this particular case, because from what I can tell from DA Fani Willis, she's not playing around. And I don't think that she is going to stand for any kind of threats to her, to the judges, to the courthouse, to the personnel, to witnesses. And this is just a fine line that Trump has walked. I mean, we can go back to the Mueller investigation where that report that Robert Mueller, the special counsel, provided had instances of interfering and dangling pardons to witnesses. In the January 6th hearing, we had indications that through intermediaries, he was trying to influence witnesses. We've had things that he said on, as you said, social media platforms. So again, going back to what I said before, will he listen to his lawyers? Will he be able to rein in his natural tendencies? Because now, very much different than when he was president or even, before 6 months ago, he's now under the jurisdiction of a court, and there are consequences to not, following the rules that are imposed upon him by the judicial system.
Right, and everyone will be watching. Thank you so much, Asha. We are, again, looking at live images of the former president's plane about to take off. It is taxiing right now from Atlanta, Georgia, taking off to Bedminster, New Jersey. Just about a half hour ago, the former president was booked at the Fulton County Jail, indicted for a fourth time. I want to check in again with Aaron Katersky, who is there in Georgia, outside the Fulton County Jail, where security has been tight all day, as we can imagine. Aaron, we just heard those comments from President Trump before he boarded his plane. Could those comments violate the bail at all?
Well, according to his bond agreement, the former president is not supposed to make any incendiary comments. He's not supposed to make any threats. That includes on social media, which was a special caveat just for him. None of his co-defendants have that as part of their bond agreement. But he is not supposed to make comments that could be perceived as threatening any witness, any co-defendant, or anyone in the community. And perhaps the comments he made may not be violative of that, but you hear some of the rhetoric start to increase when he starts talking about the Democrats or his political opponents or the prosecutor. And so I think the judge certainly is going to be listening carefully to what the former president says, but there is no precedent for how to really police this. It's going to be up to the judge's discretion whether to revoke his bond. And that would be, of course, uncharted territory, like so much of this already is, Stephanie. The first time the former president of the United States has ever been asked to post bond, first time for former President Trump. He's been asked to be booked at a jail as opposed to the courts. He did not have to enter a plea in court right away. He's supposed to come back in 2 weeks' time for that, although the judge is still arranging the arraignments. And we think this may, Stephanie, be the first time a United States Secret Service motorcade has ever been within the confines of a state jail. Because why else would a Secret Service motorcade have to be within the confines of a state jail? So much of this is unusual, and it all played out today over roughly a half hour's time.
Very unusual indeed, Aaron. Historic. Prior to Trump, no former or current president had ever been indicted. We're looking at live images now of the former president's plane about to take off there from Georgia, headed to New Jersey. Let's bring in ABC News legal contributor Kim Whaley. I also want to get your impression of those comments made by the former president there on the tarmac, where he was repeating the lie that the election was stolen moments after being booked on these election-related charges. So we're not seeing any kind of remorse for his actions 2 years ago.
Well, there's two things going on there. One is this defense that I think we're going to see that there is no criminal intent in both the federal case in D.C. and this one, because he really believed that the election was stolen. But I also think it's potentially trying to dupe and confuse voters. Because let's be clear here, the allegations aren't that he just in good faith tried to challenge the election results. The allegations are that there were slates of fake electors. There were lies on paper that were submitted to courts, submitted to secretaries of state, that there were election workers that were harassed, that there were voting machines that might have been tampered with, not all by Donald Trump, but in this broader enterprise. And so, in a way, the only election interference that's on the table, the only potential evidence of election interference that's on the table is by Donald Trump, not by the people and the many thousands of Americans that came out to support the 2020 election and to run the election at the local level. That's really how this goes. They're not the ones that committed election interference. It's actually across these two cases, the two relating to January 6th, it's Donald Trump and the people around him. And so this is, you know, a psychologist would say this is classic gaslighting, right? You punch someone in the face and say, look what you did to my hand. It's kind of creating this impression impression, oh, let's go back to election interference, it was a rigged election, when actually that's what these cases are about, that there was an attempt by Donald Trump and others to actually rig or distort or change the election result. And that's really, really very serious for American democracy. And that's why I think these cases, regardless of where you are politically, have to move forward. So I think it's a very deft political move on the part of the president, in addition to setting up this defense that it was empty, empty heart, empty mind. I was just doing my best to do my duty as president.
And just to mention some of those false claims, the former president claimed there were 5,000 dead voters. He seemed to be obsessed with Georgia, obsessed with a suitcase full of ballots, saying that those existed, obsessed with poll workers, as you mentioned earlier, a mother and daughter who were working as poll workers, local community. They were targeted and harassed. And after hearing the former president just moments ago say the election was stolen, he did nothing wrong, like you said, just kind of living in this deaf world. What do you think about his co-defendants? Do you think they're on board, that they believe the same claims, the same thing that we just heard him say a few moments ago?
Listen, just think about the people whose lives are shattered and destroyed by this. Not just the people that were on January 6th, the Capitol police officers, several of whom died by suicide afterwards. There was actually a MAGA supporter that perished that day. There were many people that had serious physical, long-term, and psychological injuries. Then you have these various co-defendants, the alleged co-conspirators in the January 6th case, their lives, their families, their financial situation, their futures severely impacted, in addition to not just the two people that are named or identified as being harassed, but their harassment against poll workers across the country. Again, regular citizens, regular Americans, our friends and our neighbors. So Donald Trump is no victim here. And I think the narrative sometimes gets distorted when this has been a catastrophe of epic proportions for a lot of well-meaning Americans.
Let's talk about the RICO and let's break that down for folks that may not be familiar with it. What is RICO and how is it different from the 3 conspiracy charges in the federal January 6th case?
Yeah, so there's, I think, 3 tiers of these kinds of crimes. One is, you sort of, again, punch someone in the face. You did the crime. That would be like a basic assault. We don't see that here. Then you might have a conspiracy, which is the next level, and there are 3 counts in the January 6th case. That's a meeting of the minds, 2 people agreeing to violate a law and then taking a step in furtherance of that agreement. You don't actually have to cross the threshold, you just have to take a step. RICO is even more broad if you were to zoom out into the stars, right? And you don't have to have a big agreement between all these 19 people to sit down and say, let's take steps, like in a typical conspiracy. Let's agree to thwart the outcome of the 2020 election. Instead, you have to have basically various acts in tandem within a certain period of time, and the prosecutors have to show there's an enterprise that is almost like a gang or like typically a mafia type situation where they're all working in tandem towards a common goal. So you could be swept up in a RICO charge based on someone else's conduct, even if you didn't sit and agree to do it. So it's probably harder to defend. I mean, like other guests have much more experience in the defense, but it's a sweeping charge, and it's one that allows the government to capture many people in this larger story of a common enterprise or a common idea. That's the big difference. Whereas in the January 6th, you actually have to show an agreement between the people that are named in the complaint, in the criminal complaint.
Speaking of his comments, the former president's comments before he boarded that plane, we were speaking of it possibly violating the bond or not. What about Trump's free speech argument? Is this a case where he's okay to speak freely under the First Amendment?
We are going to see that, I think, in a motion to dismiss one or both of these cases relating to January 6th, the idea being it was free speech. We heard this after January 6th about his speech on the Mall. That speech on the Mall didn't make its way into either of these indictments. And I just have to refer to former Attorney General Bill Barr, who says every conspiracy involves speech. There are lots of crimes. Bribery which is named in the Constitution as a basis for impeaching a president, that involves speech. So the First Amendment doesn't allow you to speak in a way that leads to a crime. We will hear that again. We can see talking points on the campaign trail. We can see things on social media. People can think my free speech rights. But legally, the Constitution doesn't just give us the right to speak in a way that crosses the boundaries of the criminal code at the federal or here the state of Georgia level.
So they can't use that defense. What about the Supreme Court? Let's talk about this possibly moving to the Supreme Court. Trump has said on Truth Social, his social media platform, that the Supreme Court should step in. How could that happen? And under what legal theory? And could it even happen?
You know, we've talked earlier about Mark Meadows wanting to take the case from state court in Georgia into federal court. And I think what's going on here is kind of this broader argument that, listen, we were just acting as federal employees, president, chief of staff, we have authority under Article 2 of the Constitution, and there needs to be a lot of discretion for people to kind of make mistakes. And if we start criminalizing decisions by presidents and their closest aides, you are going to clamp down on the ability of the president to be commander-in-chief and run the country. That is sort of this broad presidential immunity argument. Donald Trump raised it in connection with the predecessor to the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, Cy Vance. He said when Cy Vance, that grand jury, tried to subpoena his private accounting records, it went all the way to the Supreme Court. He said, listen, I'm immune from that subpoena because I'm president. I think we're going to see that kind of argument. And you know what, Stephanie, there aren't a lot of cases under the Constitution. There is no immunity expressed in the Constitution. It exists for members of Congress under the speech and debate clause, but not for the president. It's a very squishy area. And I think if it gets on appeal, which it should, and it probably will, the court would be hard-pressed not to take that case because the stakes are so high and the law is so murky. And that, again, could kick this down these cases down the calendar. But also, in a weird way, it gives it, once again, the Supreme Court, the conservative majority, 6 human beings that aren't elected and are there for life, tremendous authority to decide what could be ultimately the outcome of one or more of these cases relating to January 6th.
And some of those justices appointed by the former president.
3 of them.
3 of them. And all of this happening as the former president intends to run for president again. So how does this case impact the presidency if he is elected? How does it impact the presidency and the Constitution?
You know, it's really hard to imagine what that would look like if, say, these cases, one or more, did go to trial before and he was convicted. There's nothing in the United States Constitution banning a president from serving even from a prison. Now, it's hard to imagine how you would do that with the Secret Service. Aaron Katursky was talking about having the detail in the Georgia Fulton County Jailhouse and how strange that is and astonishing. I mean, I live outside of Washington, D.C., and you see the motorcades and the Secret Service, and it's at this patriotic moment. And now we're seeing the opposite. When you say it's unprecedented, and we all say it, it really is sort of mapping out how this could turn out. It's like a, it's like a TV show. It takes tremendous creativity to even come up with that scenario, and now we're living it in real time, and it's just really shocking and astonishing.
It really is the ultimate reality TV show that we are in. Thank you, Kim. Let's bring back former Georgia prosecutor Chris Timmons. Chris, you mentioned jury selection earlier and how it could play a really pivotal role in the prosecutor's case against the former president. Can you talk a little bit about that as we watch the former president take off from Atlanta?
Absolutely. So the key to any trial, just like the key to any decision, is the decider. And so in a trial, the decider is the jury. And so jury selection in all 4 trials are going to be crucial. Matter of fact, it's one of the most important aspects. Actually, it's the most important aspect of a trial. I teach jury selection at Georgia State University College of Law here in Atlanta. I think one of the things that we saw earlier, and you could tell from this, that this whole Donald Trump is being treated like anybody else. And I think that's a theme that the prosecution is going to use at trial. I think that they're going to say to the jury, hey, I know that this man used to be the president of the United States, but you need to treat him just like anybody else. I think we're going to hear that over and over again when we get to trial. And so what they're going to be looking for when we come to jury selection is they're going to be looking for jurors who are going to be receptive to that message, the message that Donald Trump is just like anybody else. And so when it comes down to it, that's what they're looking for. Now, the problem is when it comes to jury selection as well, and when you're the prosecution, you've got to get it right. You've got to be 100% right. Because if you end up with even one not guilty vote in your jury, you are going to have to try that case all over again. You've got to get 12 people. They've all got to agree unanimously that Donald Trump is guilty. And the analogy that I use when I'm talking to my clients about the possibility of going to trial is this. We can't get 12 people to agree on a pizza topping. We can't get 12 people to agree on a restaurant reservation. So I don't know how in the world we get 12 people to agree on guilt or innocence in a criminal trial, and add the level of magnitude to this, as well as just the cognitive bias you see in the general public. Most people have already got their minds made up, and at this point, we haven't seen a single shred of evidence. I've heard people who hate Donald Trump saying that he's going to be convicted based on all the things that the evidence that's out there when we haven't seen any evidence. We've only seen an indictment. And I've heard people out there who said even if they prove it, they're not going to find him guilty because they don't want to have Joe Biden as their president. And so the key to any decision is the decider. And in this case, it's going to be the 12 people who are selected in Georgia to make a decision on the guilt of the former president.
And we have seen the former president's plane just take off from Atlanta, headed toward Newark Liberty International Airport. Thank you so much, Chris. Want to turn to Olivia Rubin. Olivia, what do you think is the ripple effect when we see the former president's mugshot? What ripple effect will that have on his campaign?
Well, really, Stephanie, like I sort of laid out a little bit earlier, I think this is going to become one of the central pieces of the campaign over at least the next couple of days. We can expect that they are going to galvanize it. They are going to sell T-shirts of it, sell mugs of the mugshot, because really that is one of the only things that they can do here. There are really, as we have seen Donald Trump on the campaign trail now with 4 indictments, there is no running away from the reality of his legal troubles. So what we have seen from the former president when he gives the speeches, when he is at his rallies, doing his events, is that he makes the indictments and his legal troubles part of his campaign. It has become a central slogan when you hear him say, I am being indicted for you. They are coming after me because they want to come after you, and I stand up for you. So the indictments and the mugshot that I'm sure we will see soon is something that we can expect to be brought in. And as I said earlier, I did ask, one of those people close to the former president what they expect to make of the mugshot. How are they going to handle it? And the answer was very point blank, very blunt, make money off of it, Stephanie.
And we heard from the former president before he boarded his plane saying kind of the standard lines that we've heard him say before, that the 2020 election was rigged. He thanked his supporters, saying he did nothing wrong. How do you think that helps him or hurts him? It seems as though he's not refraining from saying those statements, but instead repeating those same lines. How does this help his campaign?
Well, I think, quite frankly, what we have seen with every single indictment is that the former president has gone up in the polls, and that is something that his campaign loves to tout over and over again because, like I said, they make this part of their campaign. So publicly, they say that it is making him stronger in the polls, and it is something that they are using to make money because they are, quite frankly, running out of money. But I think what we started to see last night, at least at the debate that the former president did not attend, is some of the candidates starting to say we need to move past 2020 because, and you heard John Santucci say it earlier, that the former president is stuck in 2020. And many of the candidates said this is not a winning strategy for any Republican trying to take back the White House in 24 to be stuck in 2020, because what we need to be thinking about, these candidates said, is thinking about 2024. So clearly something that at least some of the other candidates would love to move beyond because it is just a losing strategy, as they say, across the board for them.
Absolutely. And some of those candidates still saying that they would support him. Olivia, thank you so much. Speaking of John Santucci, want to bring him back in. Former President Trump reacted to his booking at the Fulton County Jail, calling it a sad day. And as we mentioned earlier, John also saying that it was a rigged election. Of course, he thanks his supporters, but he was defending himself. But again, saying that it was a rigged election despite there being no evidence. We haven't seen his support drop. Olivia just mentioned that since the first indictment. What do you make of all of this? The former president presenting himself once again in the same way.
Yeah, and I think Olivia touched on it perfectly just a couple of moments speaking to you, Stephanie, that Donald Trump believes that talking about the 2020 election is a way for him to get reelected in 2024. The poll numbers so far seem to suggest that. I mean, the average is at least 40 points above the closest person to him, which at the moment is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. So Donald Trump is not going to back down from this playlist. In fact, he's going to keep it going and put it on repeat every time he is out on the campaign trail. It is the mantra. It is the slogan. And we know one of the things that Donald Trump and his aides have been waiting for with this mugshot when it gets released eventually is to take it and print it and put it everywhere. Hats, T-shirts, you name it. They are going to use this as a fundraising vehicle because they believe that if they lean in to everyone out to get Donald Trump, you need to support him to stop this. This is a way for Donald Trump, again, he believes, to get reelected.
And as you said, definitely leaning in, not taking this opportunity to avoid the cameras or say something just opposite of what he said. John, do you think that the other co-defendants are on board with the former president? The former president getting out there to say that sticking with his same lines. What do you think the other co-defendants are feeling right now?
Well, I think you don't even have to guess. Some of them have come out publicly and said that they stand by Donald Trump. Look at Rudy Giuliani yesterday, Stephanie, outside of that jail, forcefully defending his actions, forcefully defending his longtime friend of nearly 40 years, Donald Trump. So I think for some people, it's clear they're by Donald Trump's side, but others are trying to separate, are not in communications with the former president. Some have already filed motions to move this to federal court, hoping to separate themselves from Donald Trump's defense. One of the things that we remember, because, you know, history does repeat itself here, we've covered this before. One of the things I remember covering special counsel Mueller's investigation, the first special counsel to look into Donald Trump, was a joint defense agreement. That is between all the parties that are involved working together. We have not seen anything like that form yet. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but that would signal that everybody's in this together. So far, there is no indication, Stephanie, that that is going to happen. And one of the concerns that I know from speaking to close allies to Donald Trump is that they are highly concerned that any of these 18 individuals could flip. And don't forget, those are the 18 known. We have in this lengthy indictment from DA Fani Willis at least 30 unindicted co-conspirators. Don't know what they have, don't know of anything else they could give, but obviously Donald Trump and his team trying to make sure that everybody right now stays on Team Trump.
John, this is just consistently unfolding. Thank you very much. Let's bring back former Georgia prosecutor Chris Timmons. Chris, could the district attorney, Fani Willis, face opposition for pursuing this case?
I think she will. And I think that that's going to happen. She'll have opposition in the primary next May. I don't think that they're going to run a Republican against her. They might, but they're definitely going to find some sort of Democrat to run against her who will probably be backed by folks from the Republican Party in secret. And I think that's a concern. When I was in DeKalb County, which is next door, I was a prosecutor there. It includes a portion of Atlanta. My boss was running two, at least locally significant cases. And in those cases, at the time that he was doing them, he faced a lot of pressure from the community asking him, why are you pursuing these two high-profile cases when we've got murders, we've got car break-ins, we've got quality-of-life crimes that are going on that the public perceives as being ignored. And so she's vulnerable there because she's running two giant cases, both RICO cases, one the Young Thug RICO case, and the other the Donald Trump case. And the really interesting thing would be is if she got beat before the trial was over. If you've just run against Fani Willis, if you ran on the platform of she's spending too many resources resources on these two big high-profile cases, there's probably going to be some pressure on you to dismiss the case, which could happen mid-trial. I know that's a disaster scenario. I think it's wild, but that's something that we should be considering as we move forward in these uncharted waters. They could get even more. I don't know how you get less charted, but certainly we are in uncharted waters, and they just keep getting murkier.
Absolutely. We're constantly surprised. All right, Chris, thank you so much. We want to turn back to Aaron Katursky. We just received a statement from the Fulton County Sheriff's Department. Tell us about it, Aaron.
Not only the statement, but we also now have the mugshot of former President Trump glowering into the camera as he was booked on 13 criminal charges here in Fulton County. The sheriff confirming the booking in a statement just issued from his office, saying this evening defendant Donald J. Trump surrendered to authorities at the Fulton County Jail. Mr. Trump's bond order and stipulations are the result of negotiations between the district attorney's office and his attorneys, and we know the bond agreement was for $200,000. He worked with a local bail bondsman to post the 10% required before he was allowed to be released on bond. He was in and out of this jail in about a half an hour, a little less, far less time than it takes the typical criminal defendant here. But now the mugshot is out, and the former president has been booked, and he's on his way back to New Jersey, Stephanie, after he was on the ground, what, an hour and a half or so. So the next time he's expected back here is supposed to be the week of September 5th. Unlike many jurisdictions, when the booking and the arraignments take place simultaneously, here, Fulton County District Attorney Fonnie Willis says his arraignment to enter a plea to the charges doesn't have to take place for another 2 weeks. We'll see what the judge says about that. But whenever that does occur, there will be cameras allowed in court. So we're going to see this entire criminal prosecution unfold before us on TV.
Absolutely. And you mentioned those charges, those 13 charges. I want to go through them quickly. One of them being violation of the Georgia RICO Act, solicitation of a violation of oath by public officer, conspiracy to commit impersonating a public officer, and so forth. As we mentioned, 13 state charges. We just received the former president's mugshot. We want to show that to you here in just a moment. As we get that set up for you, let's bring in John Santucci. Yeah. John, do we think the former president will weaponize this image to help him with fundraising? You mentioned this earlier, but to what point, and will it work in gaining support for his 2024 campaign?
Stephanie, I'm going to throw it back to you because I see what we have on screen right now.
Yes, we do. We have the mugshot. There is the former president's mugshot taken at the Fulton County Jail earlier this evening as he was indicted for the 4th time there in Georgia. Right now, the former president is in the air on his private plane heading back to Newark Liberty International Airport, but that is his mugshot taken today at the Fulton County Jail. John, let's talk about this mugshot and how his team may possibly use this to fundraise. And here's the bigger question, though. Will it even work?
Well, actually, Stephanie, I'm going to take that in a bit of a different direction because, as you well know, I've covered Donald Trump for ABC News for nearly a decade. And that image, seeing Donald Trump, to the obvious viewer, Donald Trump is very clearly angry. But when I saw the image just a couple moments ago, it reminded me of Donald Trump's book cover that he released in 2015. The book was titled, I believe, Crippled America. And I remember saying to Trump, after seeing the cover, I said, gee, you know, you really look angry. And they said, well, they told me to arch my brows, to look angry, just to stare down the camera. That's that Donald Trump that we see right now. And that's not Donald Trump posing for a book cover. That is Donald Trump legitimately angry about where he is right now, and feeds in, Stephanie, to everything I have been hearing in the last couple days, that Donald Trump has been raging about this indictment, raging against DA Fonnie Willis, raging about what could possibly happen, because as we know, these are severe charges, and many other people, as we've been reporting here on ABC, concerned about what will happen because of so many people indicted with him. And as one aide said to me, if one flips against us, we have a gigantic problem. But to go back to your question earlier about what he's going to do with it, copy, paste, print. They're going to put this on every possible campaign t-shirt, hat, any mug, you name it. I would wait for the moments until a fundraising email comes out with this mugshot. And the one thing that we do need to recognize, there's Donald Trump bravado that everybody sees, and there's Donald Trump personal. People you don't see. Obviously, we all have that, right? Our public face, our private face. Though Donald Trump is going to go out there and say, look at this, can you believe it, not a bad shot, etc., this is not a photo that Donald Trump personally is loving right now, Stephanie.
So you don't think this was an intentional pose? Because when we look at the other mugshots, John, I'm sure you've seen the other ones of the other co-defendants. Some are smiling, some are neutral. This seems, I mean, you could see that he's angry, but do you think this was somewhat intentional, given the fact that he may use this photo on products as he moves toward in his campaign?
You know, I try to get in Donald Trump's head. That is a dark art. I definitely do try to do it. That's what I'm paid to do most times here at ABC. But, you know, Donald Trump has definitely been angry about it for sure. But I don't think Donald Trump was standing there saying, is this going to look good on a T-shirt? I think Donald Trump is standing there saying, get me out of here. I don't want to be here. I don't want to do this right now. So I think that is more of what's weighing on Donald Trump tonight, Stephanie, than anything else.
Well, John, thank you so much for your insights and for joining us this evening. You've been watching ABC News Live Prime. We tonight just witnessed the former president, Donald Trump, being booked and released from the Fulton County Jail. A senior advisor to the former president tells ABC News that a mugshot, which we just saw there, was taken tonight at the Fulton County Jail. John and I just discussed it. We will be right back. I'm Stephanie Ramos. Stay with us.
This is ABC News Live.
The crush of families here in Poland.
At refugee centers
in Putin's Russia.
On the ground in Ukraine.
Close to the front line.
From the capital.
Destructive
Cat 4 storm.
You're along I-5. Boston is in the bullseye.
Let's go.
ABC News Live, America's #1 streaming news. Anytime, anywhere. Streaming 24/7 straight to you for free.
Thank you for making ABC News Live America's #1 streaming news.
Still catching feelings, battles so proper, and I'm thankful for your mama. Skyline, baby blue. Still catching feelings, feels for you, feelings for you, feelings for you. You feeling something, baby? Still catching feelings for you. Still catching feelings for you.
Good morning, America.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Stephanie Ramos, in for Lindsay Davis. Thank you so much for streaming with us. You are joining us on a historic night after former President Trump surrendered for a 4th criminal indictment this year, becoming the first former president in history to have his mugshot taken. Tonight, Trump turned himself in at the Fulton County Jail in Atlanta, involving what prosecutors say is a criminal conspiracy to interfere with the 2020 election. The former president landed in Atlanta just about after 7 p.m. Eastern time. He walked out of the plane and took a 20-minute ride to the jail. There, he was fingerprinted, photographed, and went back to the airport. There, Trump spoke for a short time and repeated falsehoods about the election. Many of Trump's 18 alleged co-conspirators have already been booked. Former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows surrendering today. Trump's former attorneys, Rudy Giuliani, Jenna Ellis, and Sidney Powell, have also been booked. Remaining co-defendants have until tomorrow to surrender. Trump remains the front runner for the Republican presidential nomination. Trump's processing comes 24 hours after the first Republican primary debate, which he did not attend. Senior investigative correspondent Aaron Katursky leads us off from Georgia.
Tonight, Donald Trump surrendering to authorities at the Fulton County Jail. The former president had already been booked in 3 other criminal cases. This time was different. Tonight, he was photographed, fingerprinted, And this time, he was released on bond, $200,000, and a pledge he won't threaten any potential witnesses, including on social media. As he headed to Atlanta on his private jet, the former president calling it yet another sad day in America. Trump is charged with being the ringleader of a criminal enterprise attempting to overturn the 2020 election, and with heading up a pressure campaign against local Republican officials, including that phone call with Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
Also on that call, Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows.
So, Mr. President, everybody is on the line, and just so this is Mark Meadows, the chief of staff.
Meadows has been charged too and surrendered earlier today. His mugshot right here. Meadows is trying to get his case transferred to federal court. So when will these trials begin? The district attorney, Fonnie Willis, wants to try Trump and his 18 co-defendants together, but tonight that's in doubt. One defendant, lawyer Kenneth Chesbrough, asked for a speedy trial, and the judge agreed, setting a date of October 23rd, less than 2 months from now. Trump's lawyers quickly weighing in, saying that's way too early to put the former president on trial.
Aaron Katursky is there in Georgia for us. You've been there all week. Talk about this mugshot just released a few moments ago. And also, let's talk about what happened at the jail tonight, Aaron.
It's an incredible image of former President Trump, who's one of the most widely photographed people in the country, if not the world, and that's why a mugshot was not required in 3 other jurisdictions where he has been criminally charged. But here, the sheriff was determined to make sure that Trump was treated like every other criminal defendant who comes to this jail for booking. So the mugshot was taken. He was fingerprinted, and the jail deputies recorded his height and weight that had been provided by his staff. He did not have to be weighed or measured on site. All told, the former president was here at the jail for less than a half hour before he was gone and headed to the airport. And it marked the first time, Stephanie, that a United States Secret Service motorcade has ever been inside the confines of a state jail facility.
Certainly an incredible scene there, Aaron. And this booking just marks another first. We just keep hitting on all of these firsts. The first time a motorcade is heading to a jail, and the first time that a former president is booked and a mugshot taken of them.
A mugshot taken, and former president being required to post bond. Under the terms worked out with the district attorney's office, the former president was released on a $200,000 bond. He needed to post 10% of that in order to be released, and he did that, we're told, with the help of a local bail bondsman, just like many of the other criminal defendants who show up here and who are charged along with Trump in this sprawling racketeering indictment. But that image of the former president glowering into the camera, certainly representative perhaps of how the former president feels at the airport under the wing of his private plane. He told reporters that the indictment shouldn't have been brought. He said he had a right to challenge the results of an election that he believed was dishonest. Of course, the former president was given that right. He filed more than 60 lawsuits, and he lost all but one of them.
An extraordinary night, and you said it there, Aaron, the former president, not budging from previous statements that we've heard over and over again. Thank you so much, Aaron. With me now is ABC News contributor Kim Whaley. Kim, as a lawyer, what is your reaction to all of this? The United States now has a former president who has been indicted for the 4th time and who's now had his mugshot taken in a jail.
We all know the adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? It's really unbelievable to look at that. I would say from the standpoint of the law and the rule of law, the notion that we have a set of rules that orders our society that we've collectively agreed on, and everyone should be held accountable for violating the rules, it is a vindication of the rule of law. But you know, it's also in the eye of the beholder. I think that sort of menacing, determined look is also going to read to the beholder, his supporters, as, listen, I'm going to fight for my version of the Constitution. I'm going to vote for him. I'm going to donate or whatever. He really understands how to capture the imagination and the spirit of people, unfortunately, through lies and deception. But I think there are two ways of looking at this. It's a triumph, and it's probably something that people across the globe are seeing. Okay, America is still with us in terms of being a land of accountability. But then for others, it's going to just be a reason to sort of fight harder for this other version of democracy, which really isn't democracy, but what he really represents for millions of Americans in this moment.
Exactly. How will that mugshot play a role for his supporters and those who are against? Let's talk about the Supreme Court. The former president has mentioned the Supreme Court stepping in, wanting the Supreme Court to step in. Is that a possibility? And if so, under what legal theory?
Stephanie, I think it's inevitable that there's going to be, in maybe even all 4 cases, motions filed to either throw out parts of these indictments or at least to keep evidence out on the theory that he took some of these actions when he was still president of the United States. There is a judge-made idea out there of presidential immunity. It's not in the Constitution, but it flows from this idea of commander-in-chief. Listen, we vote on a president to have discretion to make decisions and make judgments, and sometimes they are not popular. And I think that the argument's going to be, listen, some of this activity, even if we don't like it, what Donald Trump did it, we need to keep it within the powers of the presidency. So I think those motions will be filed. The district court, the lower trial judges are going to rule on them. They'll go to the appellate court, and it's going to be hard for the Supreme Court. Here, 5 conservative justices in a 7-2 decision, they voted against him when he wanted to use presidential immunity to keep his accounting records from the Manhattan DA. But we don't know, because that case didn't involve an indictment of a former president. That case didn't involve communications with his Department of Justice, communications with his chief of staff, those kinds of Oval Office, high-level decisions. Now, President Nixon tried it with his Watergate tapes and lost unanimously. But we have a different Supreme Court, and he was never indicted. So I think that, from a constitutional standpoint, is going to be important, and it might be decided by our friends in robes who are unelected.
Exactly. The court of public opinion. Kim, thank you so much. Let's get to John Santucci now. John, we have now seen this mugshot. We have spoken about it, but let's talk about it some more. What do you make of it? It is an intense look. The former president looks angry. What do you make of this mugshot, John?
I think you hit it right there. Donald Trump looks it, and he is indeed extremely angry, and plays in, Stephanie, to everything we've been hearing for the last couple of days and weeks, that he has been extremely angry about this indictment in particular, and attacking DA Fani Willis. And really, in part, Stephanie, Donald Trump angry about the indictment against himself, but angry about all the other people that have been pulled into this, because obviously now the big concern is twofold for Team Trump, right? All the legal bills that everybody is going to look to see Donald Trump and others pick up. We know that Rudy Giuliani, among others, have lobbied Donald Trump to help pay for their legal defense, but also for Team Trump, how to keep all 19 on the team. So the biggest concern right now, from what I am told, is that if any one of those other 18 co-defendants flips against Donald Trump, that they know will make the case stronger against the former president and just make things all the more difficult.
And John, you've covered the former president for a decade. Have you heard from any of your sources about how this evening has played out for Trump once he boarded that plane back to New Jersey, and just how he may be feeling right now?
You know, I haven't spoken to anybody, Stephanie, since he has been airborne. My sense is that he was rather, leaning into the fact that he knew he had to go through this for the last couple of days. As I said, angry for sure, but, not something that he is unused to at this point. I do know, as we've reported here, the fact that he had to take a mugshot was bothering him. The fact that it had to come out was bothering him. But now, as we're going to see very shortly, I'd say soon enough, Donald Trump and his team are going to take that photo, put it into an email, blast it out for fundraising, and before you know it, there will be a T-shirt with that mugshot front and center.
as they move forward in their campaign for the 2024 election. John Santucci, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's go to former Georgia prosecutor Chris Timmons. Chris, the world has now seen for the first time a former president of the United States take a mugshot at a jail there in Georgia. From a legal perspective, what kind of role can a mugshot play in the courtroom of a criminal case, if at all?
Sure. So when I was a prosecutor, Stephanie, I would use mugshots in closing arguments all the time. And so a mugshot like that in a RICO case for a prosecutor is fantastic. You look at all the mugshots that we've got, if you want to show the array of the mugshots on the screen, but you can look at them and you can say who looks like they're involved in a RICO conspiracy and who doesn't. You look at Jenna Ellis's photograph, she's smiling. She almost looks like she's in a sorority composite. But you know, in terms of trial, that's a smart move. It's a risky when you're taking a mugshot to smile on the mugshot because it suggests that you don't take the charges seriously. But when we're looking at these mugshots, you take a look at particularly Rudy Giuliani in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. He looks like somebody who's involved in a RICO conspiracy. He looks like a member of an organized crime conspiracy. Contrast that with Jenna Ellis, who's up in the top right, second from the end. She looks like she's at a picnic. Again, the message she's sending to the general public is that I don't take these charges seriously. But I'll tell you what, as a prosecutor, I'm not necessarily going to use Jenna Ellis's photograph in the closing argument. I guess I'm going to have to because of everybody else if I'm going to use them, but hers in particular is troubling. The Trump mugshot, that's a terrible picture. I'm sure he's trying to show the United States that he's not afraid of these charges, that he's angry, and that he's ready to fight. And that actually plays into this case. You've got kind of two different cases going on anytime you're going after a high-profile individual with a big reputation. The first case is the case that's going on in the court of public opinion. And that's really what Donald Trump cares about. That's what these high-profile defendants care about. They want the general public to think of them as somebody who is being railroaded, somebody who's being unfairly targeted. And so a mugshot like that says to the general public, I'm being railroaded, I'm being targeted, but I'm going to fight back. The other mugshots, though, say that, oops, didn't need me to stop. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We're seeing the president. But with regard to the other mugshots as well, when you're smiling, it says you don't take it seriously, but that's good for trial. So the second trial that's going on outside the court of public opinion is the trial that's going on in the actual courtroom itself. And so when I design a closing argument, particularly a final closing argument, when I was a prosecutor, I like to use those mugshots. It shows a defendant at their worst. And in this case, Donald Trump's mugshot shows somebody that looks like the head of a crime family. Now, we're going to see motions coming up from the defense side they're going to move to keep those mugshots out of evidence. And we're going to see a hearing about it. But my opinion is, since they're wearing clothes, normal street clothes, as opposed to being dressed like prisoners, those mugshots are going to come in. They'll probably remove from the top corner where you see the sheriff's department's logo. That'll be redacted, but you're going to see those mugshots back at trial. And so Jenna Ellis is smart here if she wants to win the case. Donald Trump, that's going to hurt him at trial, but it's probably going to help him in the court of public opinion.
And we'll certainly find out if those comments that he made before he boarded his plane will help him or hurt him. Thank you so much, Chris. Appreciate your time. Let's go to ABC's Olivia Rubin, who has been outside the Fulton County Courthouse. Olivia, what is the ripple effect from Trump's mugshot on his campaign?
Well, on the campaign, I think, as John Santucci just laid out, they are going to use this mugshot. They're going to blast it out already. You can see that his campaign has posted it on Twitter from their official campaign account. The former president himself has posted it on his Truth Social account. But while, Stephanie, they are using this mugshot for a campaign tool, the actual legal case is very much moving forward, even though the former president just got his mugshot here. If you look at the docket in this case, there have already been a number of legal filings, and it's really just going sort of at a breakneck speed, quite frankly. In the next 2 weeks, the former president has potentially an arraignment to come down to unless he waives it. And then his legal team, Stephanie, has already filed asking a judge for a preliminary hearing here in the case. And what that is about is an effort to sort of pump the brakes on an effort from other defendants in the case, Trump's own co-defendants, trying to speed up the trial, trying to get things underway already. We already have a trial set for October 23rd. So Trump's attorneys have come in and said, wait, that's not what we want. We need a trial here, and we will sever this case so that we are not on that speedy track, because that is not what Trump wants. So again, there is the campaign messaging of the mugshot, and then there is the very real reality of the legal case that is going on here, and that is really just getting started here in this courthouse that we have been at all day.
And Olivia, the former president is facing a few hurdles there in Georgia. Let's talk about the pardon and how he faces that, whether he would get a pardon or not get a pardon there in the state of Georgia.
Well, the pardon is going to be something, Stephanie, that's very difficult for him here, because it is not a federal case. So the president does not have, whoever it may be, does not have the power to issue a pardon point blank for this case here. But then there's also the fact, as we've discussed, that the governor in Georgia, unlike other states, does not have pardon power here, Stephanie. That is because of the state constitution here. So even if the governor here, Brad Kemp, wanted to give Trump a pardon, and they do not have a good relationship based on what we know publicly, he could not do it. So the way pardons work here in Georgia does not bode well for the former president. It is an independent board that has the authority to issue pardons here. But here's the real catch, Stephanie. It's that in the state of Georgia, you are not eligible for a pardon until 5 years after you have already served your sentence. And that is something that is very difficult for the former president, because that would mean that he would have to be convicted, sentenced, serve the term, Stephanie, wait another 5 years, and then apply. So that is not at all what the former president wants to hear. So even if it is successful that he can push the other federal cases until after the 2024 election, pardon himself, that is not anywhere near an option that he has on the table, quite frankly, here in Georgia.
That's certainly not something he would like to see. Olivia, thank you so much. Let's go to ABC legal contributor Asha Rangappa. Asha, you are a former FBI special agent as well. How bizarre of an experience must it have been for the agents assigned to the former president's detail to accompany him to all of these cases and to accompany him to the Fulton County Jail earlier this evening?
Yes, well, this is a clashing of worlds, I guess. As Secret Service agents, they're there to protect him from the general public, and they're taking him into a secure facility where there are other law enforcement officers who are there to, protect the public. It's very bizarre. I think that one thing that we need to imagine is, and this is sort of the bizarro world that we're in, is, fast forward to some point where in any of these cases, Trump is convicted and faces actual jail time. He is entitled to Secret Service protection for the rest of his life. That's a statutory benefit that he gets unless he had been convicted in impeachment and removed. He would have lost that, but obviously that didn't happen. So, we're looking at a future where what would that look like? What happens when a former president who's entitled to Secret Service protection, gets convicted and goes to jail? These are the kinds of things that we're facing now. It's very far down the line, but we are now looking at things that we may not have ever imagined before, like having a former president have a mugshot released.
And today has certainly been historic. No president, former or current president, has ever been indicted. Here we saw the former president there going to a jail, getting his mugshot, indicted for the fourth time. What does all of this mean for the rule of law, specifically when it comes to elections, as the former president intends to run again for president in 2024?
Yeah, I think there's two sides to this, right? I mean, one is that it's frankly tragic that this is what it's come to, that a former president has not only been indicted, but has been indicted 4 times and for very serious crimes, including trying to upend a pillar of democracy. On the other hand, one of the pillars of democracy is the rule of law and the idea that no one is above the law. And I think what you're seeing is really a robust expression of federalism in our country, where not only the federal government, Jack Smith, has been able to bring indictments for January 6th, but also the illegal retention of classified documents in Mar-a-Lago, but that states have been able to step up. And I think that's something that's really important here when it comes to elections, because, the bulk of the administration of elections is done by the states. This is a state interest. And I think it's really important to emphasize that what Fani Willis is doing here is vindicating something that belongs to the sovereign of the state, that was a harm, an injury to the voters there. And it's a different kind of injury than the one that Jack Smith is charging Trump for January 6th, which really is about our government and the attack on our government and, civil rights writ large. And so I think this is a vindication for the rule of law, but I don't think we should, be celebrating it necessarily, because it is certainly a black mark in, I guess, our judgment or, who we've decided to put in charge of our, precious democracy here.
A black mark on this country's history, for sure. I want to get your closing thoughts on today and how the simple existence of this mugshot sets this case aside from others. What do you think?
Well, I think it is a precursor to the fact that this particular case is going to have a very visceral impact on the public in a way that maybe the others don't. Now, remember, this is a mugshot. This is going to be shared on social media. As John said, it's going to be put on T-shirts, et cetera. But this is just the beginning. It looks like the rest of the proceedings here in Georgia are going to be televised. And I'm old enough to remember the O.J. Simpson case, which riveted the nation. And, since then, we have had lots of celebrity trials and all these things. Basically, once you televise something, everyone becomes a juror in a way. Everyone gets to see what is being presented. They get to come to their own judgments, and it can't be filtered through, it's not just filtered through court pictures and reporters. They get to make their conclusions for themselves. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And it will be something that makes, I think, this case very different than the ones that we've seen so far.
And as you said, this is just the beginning. There's still so much more to unfold within this process. Asha, thank you so much. It bears repeating just how much of a historic moment we witnessed today, and just how it'll impact the race for the presidency in 2024 is anyone's guess. We'll take a look at what else is at play on the campaign trail when we come back. There is still much more to get to here on Prime. A car slams into a swimming pool. The crime, police say, it was involved in before the crash. But next, the new details in the mystery plane and presumed death of a man behind a failed revolt in Russia. What Vladimir Putin is saying about the case.